Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk again to Dr. Sharif El-Tobgui. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me again, Paul. It's a pleasure to be back.
Sharif is a professor of Arabic and Islamic studies at Brandeis University in the United States. His expertise is in Islamic thought, particularly Islamic theology, law, and jurisprudence, and also in the Arabic language, Quranic, classical, and modern, as well as classical Arabic literature and poetry. Now, according to the BBC website, and I quote, June is Pride Month, a month dedicated to celebrating LGBTQ plus communities all around the world, unquote. Today, Sharif has kindly agreed to discuss Islam and LGBTQ, gender, sexuality, morality, and identity. That's the title of his presentation. Now, this is now an incredibly important subject for Muslims to understand because the West, the media, corporations, and governments now insist that everyone, including Muslims, give unconditional approval to LGBTQ plus people and communities. It's therefore vital that we have an accurate and reliable understanding of what Islam teaches from a respected Muslim academic. We need to ask, how did we get here? And realize the importance of getting our conceptual framework right, and explore the Islamic paradigm on sex and sexuality. So over to you, Sharif.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Welcome to everyone here today. I'm very happy to be back and to get into this topic, which is a very, very important topic. I don't think I have to explain to anyone why or how important it is, particularly for people who are in the West. The topic has become one that is pervasive. It is omnipresent everywhere we look. And as we will see over the course of this presentation, it is no longer sufficient for religious communities such as Muslims simply to say, oh, well, we don't approve of particular behaviors, just like we don't approve of drinking or premarital sex between men and women. We also don't approve of, homosexual behavior. The discourse on the topic has shifted so radically and so quickly over the last couple of decades that, we're basically playing on an entirely different playing field right now. And there's a whole set of deeply embedded assumptions which have conspired to make this issue something that is very, very different from a simple judgment as to what is, say, halal or haram in terms of behavior. Of course, according to Islam, essentially that's, what we're dealing with when we're talking about particular behaviors. But there is so much more to the issue than that. That it is no longer sufficient for Muslims just to stop there, both in terms of explaining our position and our religion, frankly, to those who are not Muslim, and increasingly also within our own ranks, particularly among our youth who have grown up in the West or in Westernized environments. As we will see, the contemporary LGBTQ discourse is basically, it's put out as a moral discourse. We are given to understand that this is a question primarily of equality, of dignity, of human rights, and so forth. And that if one does not approve, for example, of particular kinds of behaviors or relationships, then one is actually opposed to all of these things that are otherwise wonderful. I mean, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "A'ti kulli dhi haqqin haqqa," give every person his due right. So we believe in giving people their rights. We believe in justice. Justice is very central to Islam. It always has been. But the discourse is put across that defines justice, inequality, and rights, and compassion, and dignity, and so forth in very specific ways, which actually are at loggerheads with Islamic understandings of these concepts, and also make mincemeat, frankly, of traditional Islamic understandings of things like gender, sexuality, sexual moral norms, and so forth. And so we really need to dig deep in order to have a proper conceptualization of what it is that we're actually dealing with today. Very often you have a westernized young Muslim person going to a sheikh from quote unquote back home, a traditional Muslim country, and asking the sheikh, oh, I think I'm gay, or what does that mean? Or can I? And the sheikh just says, oh, it's haram. And the child, the youth is asking about an identity, is asking about feelings, is asking about a political orientation, is asking about many different things. And the scholar is just understanding, oh, he's asking about sodomy, can he have anal sex? Like, oh, in the Sharia, that's haram, end of story. And there's kind of a complete miscommunication because they're coming from two completely different, what are now completely different paradigms of looking at, again, sex, sexuality, gender interactions, morality, what human beings are and what it means to be a human. So we're going to dig deep and get into all of this. Before starting, I just want to tell people this is going to be a lengthy presentation. There's also a lot of detail. There are a lot of slides, and the slides have a lot of information. It is necessary, I think, given our circumstances, to take the time to go through and to really understand these issues very deeply and precisely with the proper conceptual vocabulary and the proper terminology. And that is why Paul and I have decided to give it its due and to really take the time that's necessary. In addition, I have asked Paul to post the slide deck to connect it to the presentation so that it will be publicly available. Anyone can, download it as a PDF, to use it, to review it, to use it in your own teaching or halaqas or study circles or whatever. I think it's just important that the knowledge get out and that people have access to it.
Yeah, so, I think it's going to be an outstanding resource for the coming months and years for people to come back to. It's going to be detailed, thorough. The presentation, the slides are very professionally produced, obviously from an expert perspective. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to set the record straight. No pun intended.
Right. Okay. All right. So without further ado, so the title of the talk, as Paul mentioned, is Islam and LGBTQ, Gender, Sexuality, Morality, and Identity. LGBTQ is enclosed in parentheses here, or square quote, in quotation marks, because I will be problematizing the term itself and the conceptual baggage that underlies it. And again, that's very important to the work that we need to do. So if anyone wonders why that's in quotation marks, that is the reason why. I'd also like to say that this talk today is a kind of expanded version of a talk I gave about 1.5 years ago online to a community in Houston, Texas. That talk is, if you go on YouTube, you will see it, and it has the title Gender, Sexuality, Morality, and Identity in Islam. And it's based on the same slide deck, except this deck is somewhat expanded. And so this would be, presumably the go-to lecture, once it's out. Yeah. If you come across both of those, this would be the more updated and the more expanded version. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Good.
Great. So the contents, we're going to first start by setting the stage. Now is June, the month of June, which has been identified or billed as Pride Month in many countries in the West and also other parts of the world. So we want to just look, how where we are today in the year 1443/2022, and then how did we get here? And then, as Paul mentioned, the importance of our conceptual framework. This is absolutely critical. Because as I already mentioned, the language that we use and the conceptual framework that we bring to bear on an issue are absolutely critical in terms of how we conceptualize and therefore judge that issue. And again, so many changes have taken place deep beneath the surface of our conscious understanding that we have to do a lot of digging and also expend a lot of effort in order to understand how we are really dealing with two very different conceptual paradigms now when we talk about Islam and an Islamic worldview in general, and on sexuality and gender in particular, and the kind of modern, Western, secular, modern/postmodern now worldview on the other hand. These are two very different kind of approaches, ways of looking at the world, ways of construing reality that depart from very, very different and often kind of diametrically opposed assumptions. And I think the more we realize that, the easier it will be for us in our own hearts and minds to kind of navigate some of these differences of opinion and clashes, frankly, which arise and will presumably continue to do so on this issue and others. And so after we talk about that, we will get into the Islamic paradigm on gender, sex, and sexual morality in general. And then we will go into homosexuality and transgenderism in particular. And we will do that from two angles. We will look at the kind of moral Shari'i considerations, so kind of what Islam teaches, what the Sharia says about particular actions. That's kind of from a sort of objective perspective, if we can say, the way things are in and of themselves regarding the moral valuation of particular acts. And then we'll also look at it from the kind of subjective perspective, what about Muslims who find themselves dealing with same-sex attractions or gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder? How can we understand this phenomenon? How can Muslims in those shoes deal with this in an Islamic way, while staying true to the teachings and the message of Islam? And how can we as a Muslim community support Muslims who are struggling with these types of issues, which are very real issues and can be very difficult and deep issues? How can we best serve and help our brothers and sisters in their struggle to live their lives in accordance with the will of Allah, as all Muslims are called to do? And then we will move on to a summary and conclusion, and then I will go over some resources. MashaAllah, our community has really produced some great resources over the last just half decade, 4 or 5 years, 5, 6 years, just a handful of individuals, and we'll see them by the end of this. And so I'd like to walk you through some of the resources so that you know where to go after this talk is over, and you want to continue your education on this topic and your engagement with it. So without further ado, I just want to paint a picture of where we are today.
Certainly, yes.
Yeah, so in terms of literature, we said that kind of presence of the LGBT narrative is everywhere. And so starting with, say, literature, right, we see a significant growth of LGBT literature that is targeting youth specifically over the past decade. So you have this series called The Lumberjanes, which is a popular comic book series consisting of 75 issues that is directed to teenagers. And the protagonist is a Navajo trans woman, so a biological male who's transitioned to present as female with 2 gay fathers. So this is the protagonist. In the year 2010, there were approximately 10 books published by mainstream publishers for young adults with LGBT characters in them. By 2016, a mere 6 years later, the number climbed to 80. So it multiplied 8-fold in 6 years.
Remarkable.
And then you have the annual Rainbow Book List, which provides updates concerning LGBT books, ranging from infants up until 18 years old. So there are materials, materials now being produced for the youngest of the young, so that when people first become aware of their surroundings, there is sort of an LGBT kind of presence and a narrative that is present in their kind of first acquaintance with the world, if we can say, right? Which is something that would have been unimaginable just, a very short time ago.
It's unimaginable now, I would say, for many people.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah.
And then libraries throughout the country, throughout America, as well as probably other Western countries, now host drag queen story hours. Perhaps some people have seen pictures of this. So public libraries, elementary schools, they bring drag queens, so men who are dressed very flamboyantly as women with wigs and big dresses and makeup, come in and read to children, and the children have a great laugh, and also they kind of become more familiar with and desensitized to this type of behavior, which, until very recently would have just been considered a kind of bizarre fetish that you did in some cabaret in a nightclub on the weekend, dressing up in drag and whatever. And now this is being mainstreamed, for children. So this is a very, very different playing field, even in the West, from what we were dealing with just 10, 20 years ago. And things are changing very, very rapidly. So that's literature. Now, if we go to media, we see of the 118 films that the organization GLAAD, which is one of the predominant LGBT advocacy organizations, they counted 118 films from the major studios in the year 2019, and 22 of these films contained characters who identified as LGBTQ. So this is 18.6%, which is something like 5 to 6 times the percentage of people who actually identify as LGBT in society. Now that number has shifted from 1.5 to 3% to 5% to 10%. It depends on the way you count what it means to sort of identify as LGBTQ. Some definitions are very loose. So we have to take the statistics with a grain of salt. But certainly the idea that 20% of characters in movies identify as LGBT is certainly way beyond what we see in reality. So there's a sort of overrepresentation, if you will, just statistically speaking, that we see in the movies, but this is something that's been encouraged.
But yeah, presumably there's massive overrepresentation of people in the films is deliberate policy. This is not just a random statistical fluke. So there's an attempt here to exaggerate, to make a political point, I assume, ultimately.
Right. Yes. I mean, whatever the motivation behind it, seems like there is some type of something like that afoot here. So, and then a new database from Insider confirms the existence of more than 250 LGBTQ plus characters in children's cartoons dating back to 1983. 1983 is a long time ago, so I'm assuming the majority of these are probably the last 10, 15 years. But 250 since 1983, which is about almost 40 years. And if you look at the data from 2010 to 2020, especially the latter 5 years, right? So 2015 to 2020, the representation of overtly queer characters skyrockets. So indeed, it goes like this, and then it skyrockets in the last 5 years, which is right after the Obergefell decision is passed in the United States in 2015, which allowed for same-sex marriage across the country. Sesame Street, SpongeBob, and other such children's shows have all had openly LGBT characters by this point. If we go now to schools, and I'm just talking about the United States here, California, Colorado, Illinois, New Jersey, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Washington now mandate specific LGBT education at the elementary levels or at some level of schooling. Other states have rolled out in quote unquote inclusive curriculum standards, but have not necessarily signed statewide bills, at least not of yet. Organizations like the SOGI education in Canada, SOGI stands for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. Education in Canada are devoted to advancing LGBT education in schools. And many people may have heard of the latest brawl with Disney, the Disney Corporation in Florida, when the governor of Florida actually moved to ban discussion and teaching of LGBT-related themes in Florida state classrooms in the first and second grades. So we're just talking about, first and second grades and before. And Disney, under pressure from certain groups, came out in force and said, we are completely against this legislation. It's homophobic. It's wrong. We're going to throw the full weight of our company behind trying to overturn it. And there's been a big spat back and forth now between Disney Corporation and the governor of.
It's interesting that Disney has become heavily politicized now. It used to be, I used to watch it for cartoons and so on as a kid, but now it's actively involved in political campaigns to attack politicians and their representatives in putting forward legislation. So this is extraordinary how politicized corporations, even Disney, are these days.
Right. And it's, interesting that you should mention that, because our very next slide, we're going to meet this genderbread person later on in the in the presentation. So we'll come back to him or her, the person.
I noticed the brain of this gingerbread. Firstly, the gingerbread man has a brain, which is, I didn't realize they had brains. But anyway, this one has a multicolored brain as well. That surely tells you something.
Right. And you mentioned corporations. So, going on to, actually we'll get to corporations in the next slide, but global affairs. So there's pressure growing now on Muslim countries as well to become quote unquote LGBT affirming. And so you can see here earlier this month, in June, Pride Month, the U.S. Embassy accounts in Muslim countries tweeted in support of Pride Month. And you can see here an example, the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait: all human beings should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love. POTUS, the President of the United States, is a champion for the human rights of LGBTQI persons. Pride 2022, you are included. And so I was just
wondering, is POTUS also campaigning for the rights of Muslim men of polygamous marriage? I presume he's not, as it's illegal in the United States. I don't recall him campaigning for Muslim rights to have Quranically sanctioned marriages. But anyway, that's just my
right, exactly. And we'll come to the, also we can look at the language here, right? All human beings should be treated with respect and dignity. And we would agree with that as Muslims, right? We agree with treating people with respect and dignity. The idea is that how is this understood? What do respect and dignity consist of? And we're going to realize that a big part of the challenge that Muslims face on this issue today is the kind of appropriation of language, very emotively resonant language like respect and dignity, and giving very specific definitions and meanings to those terms.
It's loaded. It's loaded language. It's not neutral language, exactly. Descriptive, objective. It's heavily loaded with an ideology. And so it is meant to kind of force you to express that ideology in the very words that's used.
Right. And the implication here, of course, is that if you're not fully on board with, homosexual behavior, relationships, family structures, and so forth, then you actually lack respect for people's dignity, right? Which that's a pretty serious moral charge, right? That's not a neutral thing to say, oh, you don't respect people's dignity, right? That's a very loaded kind of moral charge. And this is what Muslims and other kind of more traditional religious believers are facing now. And so we need to understand where this comes from and also how we can best conceptualize and respond to this. And so this, movement is also now, in some respects, has become a tool of demonization and even oppression. So AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Council, posted a tweet reading, "Do you support LGBTQ plus rights? Hamas doesn't. Hamas discriminates against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people." So the subtext here is that look at those evil, people over there who are not pro-LGBTQ, meaning they are not really part of modern civilized society, and therefore Western public should not support them or be sympathetic to their own struggles and their own plights, right, and their own oppression, because after all, they're not pro-LGBT. Right?
But the irony here, of course, AIPAC representing Israelis or Jews, the Jewish faith itself, the Jewish Bible, of course, would no way support any of these behaviors. Cross-dressing is prohibited, sodomy is prohibited in Leviticus. So the irony is that this is completely contrary to the very Jewish faith that many of their supporters, being Jews, would presumably support. So there's something very, very odd going on there, that a Jewish organization should advocate completely contrary to the Jewish faith.
Right. And, again, we'll see reasons behind that, but you're right that it would seem on the surface to be rather incongruous. Also, certain imams have been banned from entering particular European countries on account of LGBT critical teachings and preaching, right? So if you say that the religion doesn't allow, for example, same-sex relationships or behavior, this is considered hate speech for many people, and so imams have been banned, from speaking in this way. Okay, so global affairs. Now, if we move on to corporations, which you mentioned, Paul, this is something which really surprised me when I first came across this. I don't know if people have seen the Burger King Pride Whopper, which was put out by Burger King in Austria.
I thought this was satire. When I first saw this on Twitter, I was convinced this was just a joke because there are satirical organizations. But this turns out to be an actual Burger King advert, believe it or not.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And so the headline of a story that ran about this reads, "Burger King ad prompts apology after Pride Whopper campaign featuring burgers with top and bottom buns sparks a backlash." I don't know if people are picking up on this, symbolism here, but obviously you can see the two top buns and the two bottom buns. So it's like same, but also top and bottom is a not very subtle reference to the different positions that are assumed in same-sex, relationship between, basically anal sex between men, where one plays the top role and one plays the bottom role. And, I was wondering when I first saw this top and bottom, okay, do they really mean that? Like, that's so vulgar to put on a food.
On a hamburger advert, where children can buy them, it's just,
exactly. I was like, maybe they just meant like really the top bun and the bottom bun. But if you read the story, you'll find that there's a difference of opinion. There's like ikhtilaf, that, people have a difference in the like tafsir of this, burger, this Pride Whopper, right? And how to, but many people say, no, obviously, I mean, tops and bottoms, like, of course, if you're familiar with kind of gay culture and gay lingo, it's like a very obvious, reference. And so then we read, like in this article, the fast food chain's advertising agency issued an apology on Sunday for a much ridiculed tone-deaf marketing campaign announcing the Pride Whopper, a burger served with two matching buns. Now, you might think, okay, the apology, this has been ridiculed, tone deaf, that people might have objected to a major, decades old, respected international corporation. I guess maybe to say respected international corporation might be a contradiction in terms. But anyway, a well-known international corporation that has been selling burgers to the world for, decades now and has a big name, Burger King, is now selling hamburgers and naming them with terms that basically overtly reference
sodomy,
acts of sodomy, of male.
I mean, let's call a spade here. That's what we're talking about, acts of sodomy.
Yeah. So you would think that maybe people would be like, why are we being sold burgers that we're going to eat that are named after, anal sex? But you would be wrong if you thought that that's why there was offense taken at this. In fact, right, we read the ad, quote, includes a burger with 2 bun tops and another with 2 bottoms, a seemingly misinformed nod to sex within the LGBTQ plus community. Now, how do we understand this? Within days of the ad going live, people around the globe took to social media to comment on the campaign, citing the chain's failure to understand, quote unquote, how gay sex works, as well as critique corporate rainbow washing during Pride Month. So the idea is that, okay, in a real, relationship, right, you can't have 2 tops or 2 bottoms. The idea is that one person is the top and one person is the bottom. So this misrepresents the male-male sexual act because, you're presenting 2 tops and 2 bottoms. When it's not really
why don't I get my head around it? So they've been a major international hamburger corporation has been criticized for not understanding the sexual practices of 2 or 3% of the population. I mean, this is kind of so weird that I can't really
not representing it properly in
not representing the act properly in their advertising for a hamburger.
Right. It's a misrepresentation of the actual act, right? Because they don't know how gay sex works, because they didn't do their homework and they didn't consult with the LGBT community on it. And that's why we see
how would I do your homework on this? But anyway, we'll go there.
Right. So Burger King Austria, apologized. And so the post, they put out a post, and then the post continues, we've learned our lessons and will include experts on communicating with the LGBTQ community for future work, as promoting equal love and equal rights will still be a priority for us. So they've learned their lesson. If you're going to be representing, male-male sex acts in your food products, you need to do so accurately, and you need
you do. I mean, as you have, you mentioned sodomy when you're advertising for hamburgers. I mean, what's to object to that?
And then we see again here, of course, the ultimate goal is a promoting of equal love and equal rights. So again, these terms which, have a lot of kind of emotive baggage, right? Equal love, equal rights, which, once you read that, well, who would be opposed to equal love? Who would be opposed to equal rights? And the idea is like no decent person would be. And if you are, then you're not a decent person, right? You're not a moral human being. And then the last kind of thing I wanted to point out here is LGBT and Islam specifically. Now, this poster that you see here, you can see the date on the bottom is May 17th, 2022. So just last month, this was the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. And this poster was produced under the auspices of a Canadian university and was displayed within that university and also in a number of high schools in Ontario, Canada. So you can see again, celebrate the power of love, right? The constant appeal to love. And then you see these 2 men about to kiss, a biracial couple, and then you see a heterosexual couple of color, and then you see a multiply abled couple, so someone in a wheelchair and then a able-bodied person. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, you see again 2, like a biracial Muslim, 2 Muslim females, women in hijab, and they're about to kiss. Now, I blotted that out because many Muslims, rightly so, were quite outraged at this image. And so I didn't want to, expose it further, but I did want to just give people a sense of what is actually going on.
And we know they're Muslim, obviously, because they're wearing hijab, and that's they're deliberately being targeted for that. Yeah, okay.
Exactly, yeah. And so, again, so the LGBTQ Nation put out they ran a story on this. University pulls image of women in hijabs kissing after Muslim community protests. So when the image first came out, the Muslim community was very upset. They were very offended. They were up in arms. And they started, and one person commenter said, "Shame on you for such an insulting mockery post to my religion." One commenter wrote about the call to, quote unquote, celebrate the power of love. Now, the university in question initially responded to the post by stating that they understood the image might be, quote unquote, upsetting to some Muslims and calling the topic, quote unquote, complex and intersectional, right? But in the beginning, they said they were not going to take it down as the Muslim community continued to protest and to sign a petition, which garnered, I think, several thousand signatures in a very short period of time. They actually eventually pulled it down due to Muslim pressure, which I was actually quite surprised by.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this to me, the remarkable thing about this story, I mean, apart from the sadly predictable poster, is the fact that this major institution, this library, did respond to Muslim pushback on this and decided to take it down. And that is remarkable. I wouldn't have expected that, to be honest, in the West.
Right. Exactly. And it was not just, it was Islamic centers and, private individuals, but also high school students, Muslim high school students in Ontario public schools where this was posted, who staged walkouts and said, we do not accept this because our religion, again, we're looking at this particular act. The act is prohibited by our religion and it is disrespectful to our religion and therefore Islamophobic to try to force Muslim symbols, especially the hijab is like a symbol of purity and devotion, right? And to represent it in a way where two people who are wearing the hijab are engaging in something that is explicitly prohibited by the religion, as if you show someone a hijab, drinking alcohol or doing something else, or a man in a kufi and a beard, I don't know, doing something that the religion prohibits. This would be considered kind of appropriating our religion and pushing into the service of something which it doesn't actually support.
It does seem to suggest, however, sadly, that there's a hierarchy when it comes to phobias. So at the top of the tree comes homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. We should be really, really, really concerned about those. Islamophobia is not so important because Islamophobia can be accepted as long as it's in the service of International Day Against Homophobia, etc. There seems to be a hierarchy here of people you can offend.
Exactly, yeah. And the LGBTQ Nation article, it sort of ends dutifully with this statement, and we will see the degree of truth or untruth of the statement as we go through the presentation. But they say Muslim culture isn't inherently anti-gay. The Qur'an says nothing about homosexuality, unlike the Bible. Islamic history is filled with texts openly depicting homosexuality as a beautiful, matter-of-fact thing. And more American Muslims support same-sex marriage than do Christian evangelicals, Protestants, and Mormons, according to a Pew Research study. Now we notice here, the Bible says, the Quran says nothing about homosexuality. This is a,
it is fake news.
The word doesn't exist. The word is
apart from the Pew Research study, which may be true. The rest of it is fake. It's fake news. It basically is a lie, basically.
Right. And then the text being filled with openly depicting homosexuality. I know what they're talking about, and we can get to this later, but again, what they mean here by homosexuality doesn't really map one-to-one on what is being discussed here. And, and we'll get to this, acts versus desires versus intentions and so on and so forth. Yeah. But anyway, they end it this way as part of, again, a rhetorical sort of flourish to show that Muslims, how does the article start? University pulls image of women in hijabs kissing after Muslim community protests. Well, obviously this Muslim community must just be a bunch of backwards bigots because they protested over this thing which their own holy text doesn't even say anything about, and their own history has celebrated as being a beautiful matter-of-fact thing. So what's wrong with these?
Wow, it's amazing.
People, yeah, right. And so again, we have to be very careful of sort of the rhetoric that is used to frame the issue in a very particular way. So this is kind of where we are today, right? June 2022. The question is, how did we get here? How do we get here? For young people, this is pretty much all they know. If you're 20 or younger, you grew up in a world where gay marriage was a fact of life, where homosexuality was omnipresent on the television. And, but people like me, I'm only in my 40s, so I'm not that old, but this is all very, very new. I mean, I grew up at a time where this was still very, very taboo, and there was a very different conversation about it, which we will also get to as we go through, because again, there's been a very, very rapid and very radical shift in the discourse, which is important for Muslims to understand if they're going to be able to conceptualize and respond to this properly. So how do we get here? So this takes us back to the sexual revolution. Now, the sexual revolution begins in the 1960s, late 1960s, and this is sort of the most obvious proximate cause to where we are today. But there are antecedent causes. The sexual revolution, there are, things about it which started to stir in the 1930s, we'll get to this, and then came into full bloom in the 60s. And then even before that, developments that take place from the beginning of the modern period, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries also, laid the groundwork to get to a point where by the 1960s, in Western culture specifically, the sexual revolution almost looks like inevitable. If not inevitable, like it's just waiting to happen, right? And then it's waiting for a catalyst to happen. And then catalyst comes about, we'll see, in the form of the birth control pill and other kind of social movements that were afoot in the 1960s. But it's very important to understand the sexual revolution as part of this larger narrative. Now, the sexual revolution is basically, it represents a fundamental rejection of Christian, or more generally Abrahamic, religious, moral norms surrounding gender, sex, and sexuality. So up until the 1960s, at least, the official kind of moral norms in the West were pretty much aligned with Christianity. Premarital sex was very much taboo. It was not something, living together outside of marriage was completely unheard of in the West before the 1960s, at least in America, I think also in Europe as well. You did not just live with someone of the opposite sex outside of marriage. That was just not done. Like in the Muslim world today, it's unheard of. Like it's just not done. People might like have relations, but you don't, it's like hush hush. And it's not something that that's accepted. And it's certainly not something that you just would do so openly. Up until this time, also in the 1960s, people were very reticent about discussing matters that were related to sexuality. So on American soap operas, for example, in the 1960s, you could not even say the word pregnant on public television. Right now, there's nothing really wrong with that from our perspective as Muslims, but the idea was that even that was too forward. It was kind of too direct, and so they used euphemisms. A woman was said to be with child or expecting. You couldn't, if you had a movie in the theater where a woman's chest was shown, bare chest, for like 2 seconds, it was immediately slapped with an R rating. Restricted audiences, no one under 17. Without an adult accompanying them, right? This was considered very shocking. At the same time, you have, for example, pornography was completely forbidden. It was prohibited by law in the West. And I don't just mean pictures or videos. I mean also just written like salacious novels. Even that, like just, written descriptions that were very explicit, where actually you couldn't sell them legally in European capitals and in the United States. So what happened? So basically in the 1960s, you get a radical kind of rejection of these moral norms. And part of what leads up to this is before this time, right? And, at least traditionally in the West and in many societies, you have obviously the sexual act is at its core a reproductive act. We can give sex different meanings. We can engage in it for different reasons, whether to exert power over someone or to, as an expression of intimacy or love or pleasure or whatever, right? But in the end of the day, mechanically speaking, it's a reproductive act. I'm talking about the full kind of act between a man and a woman. And, in traditionally, especially before the birth control pill comes out in 1959, there isn't really a very foolproof way of contraception. So the idea is that if a man and woman are going to engage in intercourse, then they're always running a fairly substantial risk of the natural consequences of the sex act, which is pregnancy and conception. And, it doesn't make sense for any society to really have women, giving birth to children left and right, willy-nilly, where we don't know their fathers, who's going to be responsible for them. They don't have a lineage and so on and so forth. Girls are left to fend for these children on their own. Anyway, it's a big, it undermines sort of the very basic structure of society, which is based on the family, right? I mean, the family is the absolute core institution in practically all human societies, historically speaking, anthropologically speaking, and even in the modern West, although it's been pretty much destroyed or very much, undermined by this point. But the idea is that because sex and reproduction were so tightly bound together, they also were confined, at least, officially, so to speak, the official morality and social norms, they were confined to marriage, to the marriage bed, because the idea is that if people are going to engage in activity which could produce children, they should only do that, would only be morally responsible and acceptable to do so if they are in a situation where they are ready to receive that child, right? They can provide for it. It has a father to provide for it financially, a mother to take care of it, and so forth. Otherwise, to engage in this act, which could bring about children, is a huge thing to conceive a child, right? Without being properly prepared to do that is actually, it's immoral. It was considered immoral, antisocial. It was a direct threat to the social fabric, which it was, because it undermines the family. And so that's why things like premarital sex were, so taboo. Again, it happened, but it was not the norm. Sometimes girls did get pregnant out of wedlock. They would often disappear and, quote unquote, go visit grandma for 6-7 months, and stay in a home somewhere and give birth to the baby and then give it up for adoption and come back home from visiting grandma, 7 months later. And everyone kind of knew why, and no one really said anything because it was a big, big scandal, right? So what happens? So sex, reproduction, marriage, as well as morality, so religious morality, also kind of undergirds this whole system and says, because this is the nature of the sex act, right, which is based on the nature of the male and female bodies and so on and so forth, moral norms are such that, sex should be confined to a particular context. And Christianity is actually very specific and quite restrictive on that, even more restrictive than Islam, as we'll see. But Christianity is very, very specific, on this issue. And also in Christianity, not just Catholicism, which we know about today, this is just the Catholic position, but until the 1930s, all Christian denominations, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, they were actually opposed to contraception, because the idea was artificial contraception.
Artificial contraception. Yeah.
Yes, because the idea was that it was unnatural to artificially separate the sex act from its natural consequences, which is possible reproduction and insemination. And so in the 1930s, it was, in America in the 1920s, and in England and other places, contraception was actually illegal, and it only became legal in the 30s. And you had certain Protestant denominations that came to accept it as a morally viable thing for Christians to do. I mean, this is hard for us to imagine that, even mainline Protestant Christian churches did not accept even contraception. Here in the United States, until 1965, contraception was illegal in the state of Connecticut. You could not buy it.
Wow.
Right? Now, again, for us as Muslims, contraception is actually legal, and for a married couple. I mean, sex is only legal for a married couple to begin with, but it is actually we do have more latitude on that as Muslims than the traditional Christian position. But at least in the West, this kind of acceptance of artificial contraception is, I guess, the beginning, you could say, of the beginning of the separation between kind of the sex act and what tends to be its natural outcome. And then, what kind of contraception did they have in the 1930s? It wasn't necessarily that reliable. You had condoms, they were not very good. But the game changes radically in 1959 with the birth control pill. So the birth control pill is first marketed, maybe 58, but I believe 1959 anyway. And for the first time, people say, aha, now we have basically, if you take it every day, it's basically a foolproof way of birth control. So now we can really kind of just separate sex from reproduction. And if we can separate sex from reproductive consequences, then why should it be confined to marriage anymore when those consequences are not necessarily there? And so that old moral norm, which demanded that these all be tightly, bound together, doesn't seem to make much sense to people anymore. Now, I don't mean to imply that this was just because of the pill and birth control. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more that drives social change, and we're going to look at some of those factors also in a minute. The birth control pill became available all over the world, not just in the West, and it did not provoke. We did not see a sexual revolution take place in the Muslim world. We did not see a sexual revolution take place in China, for example, right? So in the West, there were other major transformations that had taken place, where all the dominoes were sort of in place, and it was just waiting to happen, and it needed a final catalyst. And
I just say it's very interesting about China, because China is officially a communist state. And so you'd expect perhaps that a communist society would naturally ally itself to more libertarian and progressive movements like we have in the West. But China is actually a very traditional society when it comes to gender relations and sexuality. So there has to be something else that's going on in the West. So it's not just the advent of the pill and the availability of artificial contraception. There are other factors at play, because these are also been available in China without the social revolution that has happened in the West. And I think it's very interesting that a communist society can still be very traditional, and a capitalist society in the West can be very extremely individualist in its approach to relationships.
Well, capitalism and individualism anyway, they go hand in hand from the beginning, right? So that's and what you say is very true. And also, so I can stress that, so far I've just given kind of purely sociological reasons as to why, kind of premarital sex was considered so taboo before. But there's more to it than that. I mean, that's on the purely sociological level. It's a very important level. And it's also important in Islam. I mean, the protection of lineage and families, one of the central domains of the Sharia, and we will see that in a future slide. But also there's just pure moral considerations, right? Because what we do with our bodies, the way we behave, how we act, it has an effect on our souls, on our immaterial souls. It has an effect on our human dignity. It has an effect on our relationship with our Creator, right? It goes beyond just pragmatic. So because so much of this had taken a hit in the West, in the traditional religious world had been undermined, right? It seems, at least the way I interpret it, is that, by the 1950s and 60s, this sort of older morality was just hanging on by a thread. And the only reason people didn't burst through that door is because there was still this fear of pregnancy. So we just all had to hold back. But once the pill comes on, okay, now we can not worry about that anymore. Let's go ahead and just let loose. Whereas in other parts of the world, okay, the pill is available, but still, like in the Muslim world, at least when it comes to these types of issues, there was still a much stronger sense of like propriety in terms of, sexual behavior and family. And so, I mean, family remains much more central and strong. And so,
and religion and faith does. There's a theocentric emphasis, obviously, in Islam,
exactly,
orientation towards the creator. And in the West, that has virtually, well, completely, I would say, vanished, where there's a great emphasis on the dunya, on the nafs, on individual desires and pleasures and so on. So for me, it's ultimately an existential and metaphysical question that about the existence of God and a religious vision of life, and to whom one owes one's allegiance and one looks to for guidance and how to live one's life. And the West now has chosen completely irreligious secular path. But of course, right, Muslims by definition haven't, and they still retain that fundamental vision of life as orientated to the worship and following of God. And of course, that is stable and enduring and leads to success in this life and the next. The West doesn't. It's a dead end, I would argue. It no longer has a vision to pursue anymore.
Right. That's very beautifully said. MashaAllah. Very nicely said. And I agree, 100%. You
agree? That's good.
Yes, with what you said. Yes. So great. So moving on. So what we see then, so the separation of sex, reproduction, marriage, as well as morality. So these were tightly bound before, both by, kind of the nature of the act, as well as, by morality. But now, as of the sexual revolution, I always say the sexual revolution comes like splits the atom, and these 3-4 things, they just all take off in their own direction as free floating variables. So sex is now just its own thing. It's not tied to reproduction anymore, not tied to marriage, not tied to morality or what God has said or legislated, right? Now we can make of it whatever we want. Okay. And so this is also important in the sexual revolution. And we will see in the next slide. So this idea of separating these 3 things is very, very important. We're going to keep coming back to this over and over again over the course of the talk. And also there are 3 other things which are separate, which the West then amalgamates, which is also very problematic. And we'll see that and come back to it several times, but we'll get to that in the next slide. So what is the fallout of this? What is the fallout of this? The sexual revolution, we said, brings about basically a wholesale rejection of Christian moral norms. For the first time, people start openly. When I was young, they called it shacking up, right? Which was a boy and a girl, man and woman living together outside of marriage. I mean, I was young when that was still very, very new. And I remember people saying, oh, they're shacking up, they're living in sin, or, oh, it was something very novel still. And many people were like opposed to it because they thought, well, that's not right. And people used to think, oh, okay, many people thought, no, you still have to be married to have sex. Other people, well, no, you don't have to be married, but you have to be in love. And then other people, and then slowly but surely, like it doesn't even take that long, marriage leads to quote unquote just love and commitment to, well, okay, well, as long as you consent to it, no problem, right? So by the 80s or whatever, you go like very slippery slope very quickly. It's just like nothing matters anymore but consent. As long as the people are not being forced and they consent, there's no more specific moral code or any specific moral standards that apply to sexuality qua sexuality, right? So there is no sexual morality at all anymore in the modern. It's just consent, which is a complete disaster and has nothing to do with Islam. I mean, it's nothing. The Islamic paradigm is completely separate on this issue. But this is kind of the world that we are living in. Okay, and so what are some of the fallout of this? So we see in the wake of the sexual revolution, we see a huge increase in divorce, which also was very taboo in the West, and in fact illegal also in some places.
Yes, that's true. We forget how taboo divorce was and how rare it was, even within our own living memory. But now it's kind of no fault divorce, not a problem, or almost the disposable relationships now. And the idea you may go through serial monogamy, as some people call it. So we're against polygamy. Polygamy is a really bad thing, but serial monogamy is okay. So you're having multiple partners, but just in a slightly different way. But that's acceptable, but polygamy isn't. Right.
And I remember, again, growing up just in the 80s, I think when I was in 3rd grade, there was one kid in our class whose parents were divorced. And that was like a big deal, like, oh my gosh, it's so rare. And, 10 years later, everyone else's parents were divorced too. And then also new at that time, right, is children, because of course with the sexual revolution, part of it in the 60s was also second wave feminism and this push for women to leave the home and to, sort of prioritize career over family and kind of, be on a par with men sort of in the public realm and so forth. And what this led to is that now you have empty homes because the man is out working, the woman's out working. So for the first time en masse, especially in like the middle classes and upper middle classes, of course, in the poor classes, women have always worked because they've had to, but in these other classes where women, before could stay home, be supported, you find now children for the first time coming home now after school and no one's there. And we had a name for that back in the 80s, which was latchkey children. And probably the younger members of our audience won't know that term, but we knew that because that was a new thing. Again, in the 80s, latchkey kid was a kid who was dropped off by the school bus at 2:30 or 3 and went home and actually had a key to his house and had to open it on his own. He's a latch because there's no mother there there's no mother in the home anymore. So it's a latchkey kid. And that latchkey kid phenomenon was something very new. Anyway, so you see also a huge uptick in divorce. Let me go back to my slide here. You see a huge uptick in divorce. There's a demise of the nuclear family. And this brings about with it huge social dislocation. So there's an immense rise in fatherlessness. Obviously, when people divorce, they don't often stay in the same location. Men sometimes, just abdicate all responsibility and take off. They're not really bound anymore by the marital bond or legally bound to the woman and child other than to sort of pay, alimony and child support. But in terms of being present, there are many homes don't have fathers. And there have been so many studies on how disastrous it is for children, both boys and girls, not to have a father, right? And we live in a society which demonizes men, right? But men, the presence of a man in the house, I'm not saying, some men are tyrants, but in general, the presence of the father in the home, a strong father figure is very, very critical for the health of children and the stability of children and therefore of society, right? And so this rise in fatherlessness is correlated with a rise in delinquency. Yeah. Also, of course, a rise in single motherhood, and then also single female poverty, because it's these single mothers who are left with these kids who are often left fending for themselves, working and trying to raise them at the same time without the help of a father, materially and also sometimes financially as well. Anyway, so you have a lot of, and so when you look at are families perfect? No. Are we saying that, okay, before the 1960s, everything was hunky-dory? Of course not. The idea is that the world is not perfect. This is not Jannah, it's not paradise. But the question is, what is the arrangement that is going to lead to the greatest amount of kind of human success, possibility of human flourishing, both, again, physically, but also emotionally, morally, spiritually in this life and the next? That's what Islam is going for. And the idea is that a strong, stable family unit is absolutely critical for that. It's critical for the stability of society and the health of society in aggregate and for individuals. And because sexuality is so tightly bound, we'll see this later on too, because it's so tightly bound to the family system, that is why norms surrounding sexuality are so stringent. And really any society, I'd say sexuality is so central to who we are as human beings, right? And this is also a big part of the LGBT discourse, so central to who we are as human beings, individually and collectively, that no one is really truly nonchalant about it. Whatever moral norms you or your society hold about sexual norms, you tend to feel them very deeply and very viscerally. Mm-hmm. So if you grow up in a society where monogamy is the norm, or heterosexual norm is the norm, and so forth, like in the West until recently, then you have a very strong reaction against things like homosexual. It'll just seem very bizarre and very weird and very wrong. Now, if you grow up in the contemporary West, where homosexuality and heterosexual have been equated, and all of the relevant differences between them have been, done away with or denied or whatever, and you don't see why there should be a distinction, you're going to feel really strong about why you discriminating against, same-sex relationships. But people tend to feel very strongly about it because sex is very important, it's very powerful, and it's very central to human life. It's not something that really any society, including the modern West.
And also, I think that the new, you've not called it by its name, wokeism, or the new, I think it's a religion anyway. It's not just an ideology. It has the characteristics of a religion. So it has its fundamental creed. It has its sinful aberrations. You're not allowed to commit heresy, in other words, disagree with it. And so it's not just that sex is a powerful and emotive subject, yes, of course, but also ideologically, it has the characteristics of a religion with all that means for the other and the demonization of a heretic. And of course, in a Christian West, a post-Christian West, what did you do with heretics? You persecuted them or you executed them. So that this kind of binary kind of thing is very strongly an American post-Puritan culture, I would argue, is also still here in England and in Europe. You have this kind of quasi-religious impulse, which is also infusing this wokeism, which I think is a quasi-religion.
Right. And you're right about that. And there are a lot can be said about, I mean, we could have a whole separate, talk about that. But yes, you're absolutely right. And that's a big issue too, that, that really influences a lot the way this kind of discourse is deployed and takes place in the current scene. So yes. So back now to this. So, all right. So what does this have to do with LGBT, right? What does this have to do with LGBT? So the idea is that, it is in the midst of the sexual revolution and the rejection of the traditional norms and the breaking up of sex from reproduction, marriage, and morality. It is in this sort of, context that something like that you see a rise in the visibility and prominence of homosexuality and gay rights, or the gay rights, or the gay, the gay liberation movement, which basically rides on the coattails of the sexual revolution. Because again, think about it, if sex is now its own thing and is not necessarily tied to reproduction, marriage, and religious morality, then again, so what is it about? Well, it's about pleasure. It's about, relationships. It's about fulfillment. It's about romance. It's about, a lot of other things. And if that's really what it's about and not about these other things, then, okay, well, two men can love each other, or two women, and, all of those other things, they seem to apply more on a par, right? If you take the reproductive and the family and the traditional morality aspect out of it, all of a sudden, homosexual and heterosexual relations seem to be much more commensurate. And so people start to see, well, okay, well, why should we accept one and reject the other? And then, of course, it was clothed in terms of, okay, this is a minority, statistical minority. And on the right, the also coattails of the civil rights movement, especially in the United States, with, African Americans, Black Americans, and so forth. The idea is, okay, well, we're a minority too. And we'll get to this later, because there's an equivalency that's very strong. And this is part of wokeism specifically. You have gender, you have race, gender, and sexual orientation, sexuality, right? LGBT. And these are all equated. And this is something which, again, for us as Muslims, these are all three completely separate things. I mean, race is one thing, and the way the religion approaches it is like very one way. Gender is very different from race, and sexuality and sexual behavior, which is what the Sharia is concerned about here, is completely different. So these are three completely different things that have literally nothing to do with each other. But in the contemporary West, they're all just thrown together as like minority rights. I mean, women are not a minority, but like, say, you have racial minorities, sexual minorities, and then women, the idea is that, okay, historically, they've been sort of the underclass. And so all of these are sort of three underdog classes. And so they're all equated, and you're either on board for justice and for everybody, or you're just incoherent at best and immoral and bigoted at worst. And again, this is not a paradigm that's really going to work at all from a Muslim perspective. And we'll see this as we go on. But it's important to realize that, again, that's a very, very strong motif in our contemporary society. So all of this, of course, puts all traditional religious believers in a difficult position. I put traditional in there because, in the wake of the sexual revolution, many, many denominations of mainstream Protestant Christianity in the West, as well as, certainly Reform Judaism, as well as, conservative Judaism, which isn't really all that conservative, have really taken on the basic assumptions of the sexual revolution in terms of gender norms, gender equality, also in terms of, the sort of elective nature of sex, that we do have the right to just kind of, have sex whenever we want, as long as it's, consensual and so forth. And so, but I'm talking about traditional religious believers, so traditional Catholics, traditional Orthodox Christians, as well as traditional Protestants, evangelicals, and others, and Muslims as a whole, have not really conceded as a body. And so Muslims are sort of, I always say, Islam altogether is Orthodox, more or less. The mainstream Islam is Orthodox, which is not necessarily the case, at least in the West, in some of these other traditions, although it is outside of the West. And that's why you see the Church of England and the Episcopalian Church, which is the American branch of the Church of England, has really been split apart on this issue, because they have so many bishops that come from Africa, where, again, socially speaking, like, they're just not on board with this, and they have a different social context. They did not go. The sexual revolution is very specific to Western culture. It's not a global phenomenon. And so those bishops are like, forget it. We're not endorsing gay bishops and homosexual marriages in our churches in Africa. Like, you've got to be crazy. And you have your Northern Europeans, Swedes and England, and, but for them, again, they're kind of inhabiting a completely different universe, which has been brought about precisely by, the sexual revolution. And so they say, no, but this is fundamentally unjust and it's discriminatory. And again, it's totally incommensurate. The paradigms, it's just like talking right past each other. And this is really why it's so important to have this conversation. So moving right along. So this slide, we're going to see it again. So I'm just going to go very quickly, but it's something I want people to really take home with them. I think it's really critical. If you get this slide, it's the key to unlocking the whole conundrum that we're in. So modern Western, I should say contemporary Western culture, right? Modern is like a long period, contemporary is just right now, and this is all very new, separates three things that are inherently bound up to each other and should be by nature and by religious law, we would say as Muslims, right? Allah created us as human beings. He created nature, he endowed it with a purpose. He also legislates morality. And so these are coherent and in tune with each other. And by both the nature of reality and by religious law and norms, sex, reproduction, marriage, and morality should be bound together. Now, I want to say that also as Muslims, we do not, Islam is the middle position. And I think from a Muslim perspective, traditional Christianity is comes across as a very, what they call sex negative religion. You have Augustine in the 4th century, right, who was a licentious man before he became a Christian. But once he became a Christian, he was so disgusted with his previous life of profligacy that he took a very, very negative view towards the body, towards sexuality. Also, there's a very heavy Platonic and Neoplatonic influence, which also very much downplayed kind of the materiality in favor of pure spirituality. And so Christianity...
I think you're right. Augustine was much more influenced by Neoplatonism, the Hellenistic Greek philosophy, than by the Hebrew Bible, which doesn't have any of these inhibitions. The Hebrew scriptures, the Jewish Bible, in other words, doesn't have any of these sex negative. I mean, the Song of Songs, for example, in the Old Testament is very erotic, actually, almost obscene for some people. But for him, he was much more influenced by Greek philosophy, which with its denial of the body, seeing the body as a prison, and so to be really close and transcendent, you had to deny the carnal nature, the sinful nature, which inevitably meant sexuality. So yeah, absolutely right. And Augustine's influence over the Western Church has been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
Right. And it's very important because, again, I think so Islam, sort of understands itself and has been understood as Muslims as being a middle path. And, this sort of, traditional Christian view, I mean, Augustine said sex was basically a necessary evil. Yes. So it's intrinsically evil because it's of the flesh, and the flesh is fallen, right? And carnal, desires where the trouble began with back in the garden with Adam and Eve. And, anyway, all of the influences that you also just mentioned, it's evil in and of itself, but it's necessary for the propagation of the species. And according to Augustine too, even a married couple should not enjoy it. They should try to enjoy it as little as possible. It's like, just do what you have to do to make sure the species goes on, but you should try to enjoy it as little as you can. So there's nothing in Islam like this. In fact, sexuality, Islam has been considered traditionally a sex positive religion. And by that, it doesn't look that way from the modern stereotype that contemporary Westerners have. But that's also because the contemporary West has gone from one extreme to quite the other extreme, probably in reaction to the first extreme, partially in reaction to it, but also part of other factors that we'll talk about shortly. But, Islam has never, sexuality itself has always been considered something pure, good, holy, if you want to put it that way, but in its proper context. So Islam is very, very strict about, illicit sex. It takes a very strong position against it, but within the proper context, which is basically the context of marriage between a man and a woman, right? That in that context, it's actually considered an act of worship. And the Prophet, as we know, peace be upon him, he said to his companions, you will be rewarded for coming unto your wives. And they said, they were surprised by this. And they said, what? Why would we be rewarded for simply taking care of our desires? And he said, do you not see that if you were to take care of your desires in an illegal way, that you would be punished? And they said, yes. And he said, well, therefore, if you do it in a permissible way, then you will be rewarded, right? So you actually get reward. And so, having relations with one's spouse is considered an act of worship. One is supposed to be in a state of ritual purity, although the act itself vitiates the ritual purity, but you're supposed to get into a state of ritual purity before, because it's as if it's an act of worship. And in Islam, even the sunnah at the moment of climax, and we'll just be explicit, one should say, Allahu Akbar, right? Which is to remember God, because it's his blessing that one is able to experience this. And our scholars consider that a foretaste of the pleasure of paradise, because it's the greatest physical pleasure, at least, that human beings typically can experience in this world. And for many people, especially even post-Christian Westerners, it's just completely, they can't wrap their mind around, okay, maybe we're cool with sex today, we don't have these hangups, but we've also thrown off Christianity. But if you want to tell me I should remember God while having an orgasm, I'm sorry, like that just doesn't compute. Mm-hmm. For even a modern, again, post-Christian, it's like religion is here and sex is there, and it's
never
the twain shall meet.
The largest church in the world is the Catholic Church, and all of the leaders of the Catholic Church are celibate men. They've never had. They just don't do this at all. It's completely so. And that's even now, even though the church is more sex positive, it still in practice is led by celibate people who've renounced sexuality completely. And then compare that with the Prophet of Islam, upon whom be peace, who had a number of wives and it had the teaching, as you just said. It's integrated in a very positive way in the life of Muslims.
Right. And also, it's important to know that celibacy has always been considered a very high calling in Christianity. Now, Christians have understood that it's not for everybody. In fact, it's not most people's calling because it's very difficult, right? But if you are able to do it, and if you are, quote unquote, called to it, you have a vocation to celibacy, that's considered very, very high. And that's why the religious leaders are expected to sort of rise to that vocation. Of course, the central figures, you have the Virgin Mary, whom we also believe as Muslims was a virgin when she gave birth miraculously to Jesus, even if she married thereafter. So she's a central figure. And then Jesus himself, we don't, as far as we know, never married. So he was presumably a virgin too. I mean, because he never married. So your two central figures are people who were, sexually celibate, at least Mary until the time.
These are role models for Christians.
These are role models.
Jesus and Mary are role models, and both of them, it would seem, were completely celibate. So,
And very interestingly, the Qur'an affirms Mary in her miraculous conception of Jesus as a virgin, but it doesn't say that she remained a virgin her whole life. And
the New Testament doesn't say it either. The New Testament, it suggests actually that she went on to have many children, because Jesus had many brothers and sisters, biological, not just in the extended sense, but in the
biological, yes, through her, right. And I'm not aware that Muslim sources believe that Jesus got married either. So we probably believe that he didn't. I mean, I don't know if I've never heard anything to the contrary, but nevertheless, right. And although Jesus, of course, is very, very highly, one of the greatest prophets in Islam, right? You have the five, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, peace be upon all of them, are the five greatest. The Quran explicitly repudiates the Christian idea of monasticism. It says, La rahbaniyya, the Prophet, peace be upon him, La rahbaniyata fil Islam, there is no monasticism in religion. And Allah says in the Quran, we read in the Quran, Wa rahbaniyatan ibtada'uha ma katabnaha alayhim, monasticism which they innovated, that they introduced as a
no divine warrant for us.
Yeah, exactly, as a reprehensible innovation in religion that we, meaning God, did not prescribe upon them. So anyway, so Islam, and you also find, like, obviously descriptions of paradise in the Quran do very strongly suggest that people will enjoy sexual congress in paradise, in addition to the other types of bodily pleasures that are mentioned, like eating and drinking various, delicious fruits and foods, and reclining on sofas of silk and so on and so forth. And then the greatest pleasure of paradise, of course, is the vision of God himself, right? The ru'ya. But nevertheless, the Quran, doesn't really have a fundamental problem with these sort of the physical aspect of being, but it brings it under the divine law and the divine ruling, and it dignifies it and sanctifies it by making these bodily functions, so to speak, a concern, part of the divine concern, shall we say. So Islam some have said that, I remember Christopher Hitchens once said, Islam is very grubby. It's like kind of in the dirt, he said. I mean, he was an atheist, but he was very anti-Islamic,
Very.
He was, I remember, he's very pro-Bosnian back at the time of the war, but that was not a religion. He was very critical of the Islamic religion. But what he meant, he said, Islam's like very earthy. And I think even though he's an atheist, he's still coming from this kind of Christian background. And what he doesn't realize, that for a Muslim perspective, Islam is actually, the companions, the disbelievers of Mecca said, your prophet even teaches you how to go to the bathroom. Because in Islam, we have to clean ourselves a particular way, use water, and so on and so forth. Like, you don't just do it any which way, because cleanliness and nadafatu min al-iman, cleanliness is part of faith. And so the disbelievers made fun of the Muslims, like, what kind of prophet is even teaching you how to clean yourself? And he said, yes, that's right. He teaches us even how to clean ourselves, because this becomes also an act now that is endowed with significance because there's a proper way to do it. There's a sunnah behind it, a way of following the prophetic guidance. And this is what guidance is, all it's comprehensive. And so you have this, notion that these bodily functions, they have to be, of course, trained, and they have to be schooled, and they have to be reined in, and they have to be directed in the proper way, but they are not in and of themselves wrong or bad. And that's why you have Muslim scholars with no qualms whatsoever talking about, these things in paradise, and even writing some of the great scholars. I mean, I'm kind of going a little off topic, but again, I think it's important for us to realize from a large percent, because we will be told that we're prudes. If you're not on board with the LGBT, then you guys are just repressing this. No. Islam very much throughout its history, has been very open. We have major scholars of the religion who also wrote basically sex manuals. I mean, not just about fiqh, the rulings of it, but how to actually pleasure your spouse and yourself in different positions and so on and so forth, written by religious scholars. This is part of their scholarly output. It's a completely legitimate, subject of inquiry. No problem whatsoever, but within the proper context. So Islam has always had that middle. I think the Christian perspective was so anti-body, anti-sex, also, I think maybe, quite anti-woman in a lot of respects too, with, Eve was the one who brought sin into the world and so forth. There's nothing equivalent like that in Islam, right? That it went from that to sort of the other extreme. And we see that now. But, as Muslims, I think, again, Muslims, especially in the current Western environment where we are compared to the current environment, we are very strict and quote unquote like prude. I mean, prude, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad word, but very restrained. And we have a stern sexual morality. Absolutely. And it's central to our religion. But that just means that sexuality has to take place in the right context. And we're very, very insistent upon that. But in that context, it's a fine thing. It's a good thing. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And that's the proper balance. That's what we would say as Muslims is the proper balance. All right. So moving right along. So you have this separation, right, of sex, reproduction, and marriage. We'll see this again. And also now coming back specifically to the LGBT issue, and we'll see this again too, and we'll go into much more detail, that while it separates these three things, which are by nature and moral law and religious, prescription tightly bound to each other, it also amalgamates or puts together three things that ought to be rigorously separate, and which were separate before, and which contemporary Western culture starting in the late 19th century started to put together, namely desires, actions, and identity. And desires, particularly same-sex desires, homosexual desires. And when I say desires and actions are put together, what I mean by that is that, because morality is thrown out the window now, religious morality, the actions are seen to flow from the desire. The presence of the desire is sort of where we start. And then if the desire is present, as long as everyone consents, right, then the action naturally flows from it. It's unobjectionable morally because it's simply responding to the desire, and there's no consideration on the basis of which the action should be repudiated in a moral sense, right? So you have desires, actions flow from it. And then this is key. This is absolutely critical. And we'll see this, in a future slide, that on top of this is built now an entire personal identity. And this starts in the late 19th century, 1860 or so. The word homosexual is coined in German, Homosexualität, and then it's taken, that's actually, a Greek borrowing. But anyway, it was coined first in the German environment and then taken into other languages in the same form, essentially. I mean, there's a German word for it, but they coined it with that Greek. Anyway, and so only quite recently in Western society have people started to see themselves in terms of having a sexual identity. And again, very important, because anyone who grows up in the modern world will take it for granted. Oh, you're gay or straight, or gay, straight, or bi, or, and I read all the time, everyone has asexuality, right? Well, which is your sexuality? Well, no, this idea of asexuality, like ITY, as an abstract noun, this is also a new coinage. Like, what is sexuality? How do you say that in Arabic, or other languages? It's a new thing. So the idea that even 100 years ago or 110, 20 years ago in the West, if you were to ask an average person on the street, are you straight? They would have said, what do you mean am I straight? Like they wouldn't have even identified as being quote unquote straight. No one really identified in terms of being either gay or straight. For us, again, it's so ingrained that you're either one or the other, or somewhere in between. So you're bi, but you have to be either gay, straight, or bi. Well, how come no other culture even has words, that correspond to any of this? Because they didn't have the concept. Sexual behavior was something you did. It was not something you were. And we'll see this very important, right? Even, people have been engaged in same-sex behavior. It's attested throughout history, and we can see it. And we know it goes back at least to the time of the people of Lut, right? And it's in Greek culture. You find it also in Muslim culture. If you look at the actual, culture, of course it existed. It's practically universal, not totally, but practically universal. There seem to be some tribes that don't have a concept of same-sex behavior, but it seems to be quite rare. But the idea is that this was something things that people did. It's not something you were. And the analogy would be other sexual behaviors for us today as modernized or modern westernized peoples, right? Someone may or may not engage in X act or Y act or, I don't know, masturbation or something like that. And, whether you do or not, it's like something you either do or you don't do. It's not something you are, and you would never think of identifying yourself based on do you do this particular act or not. And we say, yeah, but homosexuality is different. Well, yeah, it's different to you because it's been constructed that way in your particular cultural milieu at this time and place. But even in the West, until quite recently, no one thought in terms of, of sexual. There was no such thing as a sexual identity. It's all very new, and it's all very culturally contingent, historically and culturally contingent. It's very important for Muslims to understand, because forces in the West, right, they present this as something that is universal, that is just natural, that is just the way things are. And if you're not on board with this, then you are simply, you're unnatural. Like you're going against just how things are, and you're denying reality. And you say, listen, you can only go back a little bit. And even in your own culture, you have no such conception of this. And so by what fiat, by what right do you sort of, have the fiat to just say, well, this is now a universal truth? Okay. Anyway, let's go on, because we have a lot to do, and I want to make sure we can get through this.
Yeah.
So very quickly, so the sexual revolution, I said, is the most important kind of, and the most proximate cause of where we are today. But the sexual revolution itself has antecedents, and again, important for us as Muslims. We're trying to get a large conceptual and historical view of the issue so that we can understand them in their proper context and as deeply and as accurately as possible. So sexual revolution has antecedents, right? This goes back to, you could say, the rise of sort of the modern period, 15th, 16th century, 17th century, particularly with the scientific revolution. Again, I'm not going to say much on this. At the bottom of this slide, you're going to see a talk I've given on these things in much more detail, so I'll refer you to that. But with the scientific revolution in the 17th century, you have the rise of a materialistic, mechanical view of the world, right? The world is now seen as just being this kind of clock ticking along, material stuff out there. And one of the results of this is that God essentially is cut off from his creation. Not really, of course, because if we're not for God's will, the whole creation would cease to exist in the blink of an eye. But in people's minds, right, in their worldview, they no longer see God's hand in his creation, right? Whereas before, there things were created with a purpose, and they were given a teleology, a purpose by God, and they were seen to have a particular nature that was imbued, through divine agency and so forth. The universe as a whole, as well as human beings collectively and individually. And this starts to fall by the wayside in the Western consciousness with the rise of a kind of materialistic and mechanical worldview. So you have a loss of inherent meaning and purpose, right? And this is important because if there's no meaning out there in the world, there's no intrinsic meaning, no inherent meaning, and there's no inherent meaning in human existence or my personal existence, then either you live in a world without meaning, which is one of the main themes of modernity. How do we grapple with kind of the meaninglessness of it all? Which is why you have so much absurd art and pessimistic art, because people are really staring this meaninglessness in the face, right? So either there is no meaning, or whatever meaning there is, because there's no meaning out there that's been put in it by a creator God, the only meaning that there could be is something that's self-generated. I generate the meaning and I impose the meaning. And that goes back to why we say now, as of the sexual revolution, okay, the male body and female body, they don't mean anything anymore. There's no inherent it's obvious that they're meant to be complementary. I mean, just, a 5-year-old could tell you that. Just look at the one body and the other. It's clear that what was meant to go where and how it's all supposed to fit together. But the idea is that there is no more, this is not seen as like intended or endowed with like an inherent purposefulness or teleology or nature that, that to violate would be a moral violation, right? Your body is just stuff. And you inhabit it as this immaterial mind, and it's up to you to run your stuff however you want, do with your stuff whatever you want, and to give whatever meaning to your stuff and what you do with it that you want to, right? So you're just sovereign to kind of impart meanings. And this is totally different from the pre-modern worldview, completely, alien to the Islamic worldview, obviously, right? But this is sort of very central to the modern consciousness. So that's 17. Now, if we go into the 18th century, you have the Enlightenment, right? And the Enlightenment is basically puts human reason in the center and makes it the standard of all knowledge, including moral knowledge. Now, what falls by the wayside here? Revelation. Revelation gets discredited. We're talking about specifically the Bible, because that's revelation for the West, was the Bible, the Christian and Jewish scriptures. So this is discredited for, higher biblical criticism, very important here. I know you've had many guests on here who are world experts who have discussed that issue. Also, geological findings, which were incompatible with a straightforward reading of Genesis, the timeline of Genesis. Darwinism in the 19th century is a major secularizing factor, although it doesn't necessarily entail, atheism. Nevertheless, sociologically speaking, there's no doubt that Darwin's theory of evolution had a massive impact on the kind of loss of meaning and sort of religious sentiment in the West. There's a book written by Owen Chadwick, I believe a British scholar.
Yeah, professor at Cambridge, I think. Yeah.
The secularization of the European mind in the 19th century. So it's really the 19th century where all of this stuff trickles down, and the average everyday person in the West mind becomes secularized. And so at the beginning of the century, of the 19th century, you cannot be hired in a university to teach if you're an atheist. Who would hire an atheist to teach people in a university? It's just considered so, deviant and immoral. Where do you get your morals from? You don't believe in God. You don't believe in an afterlife. How can we trust you? And by the end of the century, you have Nietzsche famously declaring, again, blasphemous from a Muslim perspective, quote unquote, God is dead, right? And in the space of 50, 60 years. Right. So anyway, that's jumping ahead. So 19th century. So we have the rise of the materialistic mechanical worldview pursuant to this scientific revolution. You have the Enlightenment of the 18th century, then liberalism. All of these are humongous topics, obviously. I'm just giving a very, very quick, overview. Liberalism in the 18th, 19th century, classical liberalism, it puts a premium on human individual freedom and personal autonomy. And this, in a sense, makes sense. Okay, if there's no God anymore, really, in our consciousness, and the world is just there, now man rises to the top, right? This is kind of the deification of man. Mm-hmm. So we are at the center. We are sovereign. We can rule the world. We're no longer standing under a God. The world is not standing. We are the masters. We're in control, and we demand absolute, maximum freedom and autonomy as a species to do whatever we want, to the planet, with the planet, whatever, and also in our own societies to structure them the way we want in our own lives as well. We have this ultimate freedom and autonomy. So freedom, of course, everyone, appreciates freedom when you talk about political freedom from tyranny and so forth and oppression, of course, but the modern psyche has a very particular notion of freedom, which goes well beyond that. It's almost a fetishization. I am here. I am born to be absolutely as free as possible from all external constraints, be they moral constraints, religious constraints, the ties of family, the ties of tradition, the ties of society, right? Every, such tie is just a barrier that is meant for me to break in order to actualize my own self. So this self-actualization, this self-realization. And we'll see, again, a little bit more in detail where this comes from. This is absolutely critical. And this is very deeply embedded in current discourses surrounding sexuality in general in the West, and homosexuality and LGBT in particular. And again, these assumptions lie so deep beneath the surface that we are really not aware of their presence, because they're so buried, and they've impacted our psyche so much that we just, of course, like that's just natural. You just think that's the way the world has always been. That's the only way to see it. And you don't realize that this is actually just a particular way. I see the sun reverberating on my face, so excuse me. So you have that. And then again, I will refer you to a lecture I gave that goes into this in a lot more detail. It's called Negotiating Paradigms, Islam and the Modern Worldview. Every blue title you see in this presentation is a hyperlink. So again, this slide deck will be available to you, and you can just click on the blue links, and they will take you directly to what they're connected to. Sexual Revolution, Antecedents, very, very quickly. There's a great book that came out in 2020, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. There's a subtitle which is quite long. It's something like Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Sexual Revolution, something like that. So
quite a jawbreaker for us.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a very, very good book. And also just this year, I mean, literally in March, he came out with a abridged version of it called Strange New World. But if you can read the original, I would definitely do it. It's maybe 400 and some pages. It's quite a thick tome, very, very well done. But for more of a lay audience, so to speak, I mean, there is a 180 page kind of, digest of it, if you want, with the main points. And so I'm taking this, what I'm presenting on this slide is taken from Trueman. So he traces back to Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, of course, is a Genevan, Swiss philosopher and man of letters of the 18th century. So his dates are 1712 to 78. And very quickly, so Rousseau locates identity in the inner psychological life of the individual. So this is what Trueman says is the beginning of the psychologization of the human being, right? So for Rousseau, feelings are central to who we are. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It's like this is the air we breathe. Authenticity, another very important word for the modern individual. Authenticity is tied to the outward expression of inner feelings, right? So who I am is not the role I play in society, which in other society, okay, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a son. Who I am is the roles I play. No, who I am is my own private, personal kind of inner feelings. That's the primary locus of who I am. And to be authentic means that I live outwardly exactly in accord with my inner feelings. Now you can say, fine, but your inner feelings need to be controlled, and they need to be, molded, and they need to be shaped, and they need to be trained. Right. And Rousseau probably would have agreed with that. But again, the seeds get set. And then as this idea develops, it becomes more and more like whatever I feel inside is who I truly am deep down. And for me to live authentically, I must be able to live outwardly how I feel inwardly. And any discrepancy between the two is a lack of my proper self-realization. It's a lack of my becoming fully the human I am supposed to be, or I am deep down. And you can hear in this resonances of what we hear around us today, especially in with transgenderism, right? Okay, I have a male body, but I am a woman. Not I feel like I'm a woman, but I'm not, so I feel like that way there's an issue. But I actually am a woman, because if I feel like I'm a woman, right? You can say, but wait a minute, but you've got a male body. So are you a woman or a man? Well, this is a metaphysical question. People have to realize this. It's a metaphysical question. What role does the body have to play in the definition of who you are, and what role does the mind, the inner subjective self, play, right? Is it all the physical and the psychology means absolutely nothing? Is it all psychology and the body means nothing? Is it both? These are metaphysical questions. And the fact that we have gone from, in just a couple years, especially on the transgender issue, 10 years ago, gender identity disorder, that's what it was called. That means if you have a male body and you feel like you're a female or vice versa, then you have a disorder. Now, we're not blaming you morally for that, because it's a disorder. Okay, you couldn't help it, but people recognize there's a disorder. It's not supposed to be the case, quote unquote. If you have a male body, you should identify as a man and feel like a man. And if you don't, okay, there's a disorder there. We need to try to figure out what to do. Right? That then changes to gender dysphoria. Dysphoria just means, okay, I'm uncomfortable with it. So it's no longer a question of you're objectively like out of kilter or off kilter, out of sync with your biology, and that's a problem because you're supposed to be one integrated person, right? It now becomes, okay, dysphoria. Well, if you're troubled by that or uncomfortable, okay, then you've got dysphoria. We'll try to help you. And now, just a couple of years later, even saying gender dysphoria is considered offensive to many in these movements. And the idea is like, no, I am a woman or I am a man in the wrong body, period, right? And the body's wrong. The body means nothing. The objective kind of physiology, it doesn't matter. It's all the psychology. It's all, so it's the maximum. And so Truman will say, well, this is, I mean, Rousseau would have been aghast, I mean, probably, but he would say this is kind of the ultimate, logical outcome of this idea of making the internal, giving such primacy to the internal.
But this is not really new in the West. We have this idea of dualism, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, where the idea is you have the body and the soul is preeminently important. That's the precious thing. That's the soul is that which you gain knowledge of the divine and become divine in a way. And the body is seen as like a prison. It's called a prison in Platonic philosophy. So this is the old hoary notion of dualism, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, resurfacing post-Renaissance in Rousseau and his thinking. But it's not really new. It's a fundamental category that we see much earlier in Greek thought, resurfacing in the modern world, and is very contrary to the Abrahamic faith. So the Hebrew Bible, for example, has a much more integrated, holistic understanding of the human being as being one, sort of a part soul, part mind, part body, not as dualism where it's split apart. So I think we're seeing some deep Western tributaries here surfacing up again in the modern times, which are not really new. I mean, okay, they have certain new configurations, but the fundamental metaphysical duality is there over millennia, I would argue.
Right. And again, I think that's a great point. And I think, really, like the Arabs say, la jadida tahta shams, there's nothing new under the sun, like it's plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, right? I mean, there's really nothing new. I mean, all of these ideas, atheism, is all, just recycled from like the sophists and ancient, but it takes a different guy. So you're right that you have that dualism, but I think it's given a specific valence in the modern period that, it becomes sort of this very specific outgrowth, so to say, of something that had seeds there before, but was also kind of balanced out by other types of considerations, which fell by the wayside. And then you get this kind of excrescence, right? This outgrowth of this kind of like very radical internalization and subjectivization and personalization and individualization of the notion of the human being, right? And this is absolutely fundamental to the modern, and this is at the base of people saying, well, this is who I am, right? It's not just sexuality, right? And the idea is because you're not anything other than your internal feelings. And if you're going to deny me that, well, then you're denying me my very humanity.
Well, what's
so it makes sense why people say that, but the whole thing is kind of like there's a wrong turn been taken. But it helps us to
what's tragic about this is that because we've been here before in some ways, yes, there are unique configurations, as you say, that the West keeps on having to go over the same ground over and over again and relearning the same lessons. There's no stability or continuity in the Western tradition. It's this complex composite of different traditions, pagan, Christian, Jewish, and so on. And they keep on throwing up the same paradigms, and we have to go through the same heartache and catastrophe again and again, learning the same lessons. And Islam obviously presents itself as a final dispensation, but it offers stability and a kind of divine wisdom in the social order. So we don't have to keep on searching for solutions to these problems. We've got the perfect template, which is in part the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, but also the teaching of the Qur'an and so on. So but Muslims are spared this agony of these convulsions of going over the same thing over and over again, because they have the sunnah, I suppose, that they can follow.
Exactly. And that's why the sunnah is so important. It's really the firm, al-urwat al-wuthqa in the Qur'an, that it's the firmest handhold, right? Holding on to the religion, holding on to the rope of Allah, hold on altogether to the rope of God and do not separate from it. Do not separate from each other, because that is what brings you to safety. Otherwise, you're just going to be adrift, literally, and drown.
Exactly.
And I think what you said too is very important about the integrated nature of we are body, we are mind, and we are soul. We are all three together. And the idea is that is why in Islam those three are never separate. If you look at the Muslim prayer, what is it? We pray with our bodies. Our bodies are moving. We're praying with our tongues and our minds because we're saying and reciting certain things. And obviously, the most important thing, where is the heart? But that's not the only thing. It's all three together. And from a Christian perspective, it's like, well, who cares where you're standing? Why do you have to wash before praying? Why would you wash before you pray? Well, no, because you have to be in a state of physical ritual purity. Well, why? Jews understand
the only there in the Bible, the prophets Moses and so on are all depicted as doing wudu before they prayed. Well, what? Absolutely. This was the norm, biblical norm. But today it's completely, like many other things in the Bible, completely forgotten by contemporary Christians.
And submission, ultimate, attitude of submission is to take your head, which is the highest part of you, right? And it contains your brain, and your face is the most noble part, and to put it literally at the lowest point, which is
what Jesus is portrayed as doing in the Gospels. Jesus is portrayed as doing that.
Right.
Many of the prophets as well. Yeah.
And when you do it, you're saying, Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, glory be to my Lord, the highest. So he's the highest, and you're putting your highest part in the lowest, and that's the proper relationship, because he's the master, and he's the creator, and you're the creature.
And that's where true freedom comes from, the Islamically. Freedom from nafs, freedom from the dunya, which enslaves and takes us over, whereas the world looks to the dunya for freedom,
right?
And of course doesn't find it, because it's simply more of the same. So
and not only is it freedom, the ultimate true freedom, but also it is the ultimate realization of the actual human teleology. Because in the Qur'an, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, I did not create jinn and mankind except to worship me. So worshiping and submitting to God is actually our deepest nature and objective nature, right, implanted in us by our creator. And so this notion of the fitra, right, the fitra, which is the original human disposition, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that every child is born on the fitra, and then after that its children teach it, different religion, Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, something other than like just the pure kind of, because these other religions, they started but then they changed, right? Anyway, and so it's important that, you just look at the Muslim prayer. That's why it's integrated. And that's why all of life, you come to sexuality, it's neither, it's not God. In the modern world, takes sex to be almost like God, but it's also not the devil. It's given its proper place, and it's brought under the realm. So that's very important. And as you had said earlier, this comes more from probably Greek, certain tributaries, and not really from the Hebrew.
It's very clear if you know a bit about Greek philosophy and Greek thought, that this is very familiar territory. It's not that new at all, really.
Right. Okay. So very quickly now, moving along. So Marx, and again, Marx, a huge figure. This is like a half a line, right? But in general, religion is a sign of weakness, and freedom, can only be achieved through the abolishment of religion. So this is very familiar to us as modern people. Again, we are usually, unaware of the degree to which our psychology is really influenced by Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud. These people, it's like they live on, it's like they have left such a sediment in our minds and consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we realize that, we can say, wait a minute, but I don't want that. I don't have to, Anyway, Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, the quote unquote death of God, basically leads also to this notion of the death of human nature. If there's no God to provide stability to the world and meaning, then also human nature is kind of untethered from its source. And so we read in the Qur'an, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُم. Do not be like those who forgot God, so he caused them to forget themselves. And this is, you see this in modern Western history. People turn their backs on God, and then they don't know who they are anymore.
Exactly. And the only is Friedrich Nietzsche actually was very perceptive in many ways. He shared the Muslim critique of many aspects of Western and Christian life. The kind of the death wish, the denial of the sexuality. He understood all that extremely well, right. And he had actually many positive things to say about Islam as well. This is the irony, and yet he persisted in his atheism and sought refuge in a kind of Greek kind of virtue ethics in a way, heroism, but no, he was not all. A lot of what he said was actually very insightful, although he obviously had a fundamental problem at the heart of his worldview, though.
Absolutely. And again, 2 lines is not at all to give Nietzsche his due. I mean, because he's quite profound and prophetic in the sense that he really foresaw what the West had done, and that's his whole the marketplace, the guy going out right. So he was telling people, you European Christians or post-Christians in the late 19th century, you don't understand the implications of the Enlightenment, quote unquote, killing of God, right? And you're just riding on the fumes of Christian morality and civility, but you don't understand the implications of what you've done. I do. Yes. Now, he didn't go back and say we should believe in God, but he foretold, that what this would lead to. So anyway, Sigmund Freud then comes along and he sees sex as absolutely foundational to human personhood and happiness. Freud is extremely important. I mean, his theories have been debunked for like decades and decades, but he lives on in so many aspects of our culture and our psyche. And so he's really the one who says, again, God is gone, right? He was an atheist. I mean, all of these, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, these are all hardcore atheists, not Husserl, but these other, they're all atheists, right? And this is not neutral. If you ask a Muslim, is your view of the world and the way you perceive things, and is it influenced by your belief in God? Well, of course, yeah. I mean, it's profoundly influenced. So how can someone be an atheist and that's not going to profoundly influence the way they look at the world? We cannot just take these thinkers as like neutral, right, and think that their atheism is not very germane to the ideas that they come up with and the way they perceive the world. So we have to be very careful of that. Anyway, so Freud makes sex absolutely foundational to human personhood and happiness. However, he realizes that it's a very powerful force and that civilization, the possibility of civilization requires it to be contained. But so he sees this fundamental struggle. So he wrote that word civilization and its discontents, and it's that sexual discontent. And he said even infants are sexual, right? So this is, again, so Freud is very, so we see through Rousseau and through the 19th century kind of increasing psychologization of the human person. And then with Freud, we get the sexualization of that inner psychology. So you are like very much your inner psychology, right? And now your sexuality is at the core of that inner psychology.
And then in America, you get people like Kinsey, the famous psychologist in the 50s and 60s, who continued Freud's work and also did actual empirical research on the sexual life of babies, which I won't go into, but he continued precisely this trajectory and had a huge influence, obviously, on the sexual revolution in the 1960s.
Absolutely. And so I didn't put him on here, but definitely Alfred Kinsey is very central to this. Nietzsche, Freud, and Oscar Wilde, they concur basically that moral notions are essentially a matter of taste. This is very important. It's also referred as emotivism, and this is discussed at length by Alistair MacIntyre.
A British guy, a British philosopher who's living in North America. But his book, After Virtue, which I read, is absolutely extraordinary. If you want to understand a very profound, and in many ways, a very positive understanding of moral theory at a fairly advanced level. He used to be a Marxist, actually, and became a Catholic through his study of Thomism. That's the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, and hence the word virtue, which is. But he's a brilliant philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre. Still very much with us, I think. Absolutely, yeah. So, but this notion that I was going to say actually, Freud making sexuality the center of the personhood. We read in the Qur'an, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you seen him who takes his desire as his God? Yes. And this is literally, I mean, subhanAllah, you see, like Nietzsche, okay, we forget God, so we don't know who we are anymore. Freud, we don't have God, so we take our desires as our God. And like this literally what they're doing, like this is like a confirmation of what the Quran is saying. Well, the Quran is, I don't know obvious thing to say, but the Quran is incredibly profound and insightful to all these things. Yeah,
exactly, right. And so this idea also that it's a matter of taste or emotivism, right, is similar. That it's just a question of and we'll get to this too because we read verses, and this is very important for Muslims too, right? You can't just look out and say, oh, this appears to be good, or society says it's good, because in the Quran, right, it says, أَفَمَنْ زُيِّنَ لَهُ سُوءُ عَمَلِهِ فَرَآهُ حَسَنًا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ يُضِلُّ مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَيَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ. What about one whose evil deeds or foul deeds have been made to look beautiful to him? They've been beautified for him so that he sees them as good. Wow. So you can see something as good and beautiful, but that's not because it is good and beautiful. It's because zuyyina laka, it's been made to seem that way. And who's doing this tazyin? Who's doing this adornment of it? It's Satan. And that says in the Quran too, right? That this hubbu bird, when it comes from Bilqis, the queen of Sheba, back to Solomon, it says, وَجَدْتُهَا وَقَوْمَهَا يَسْجُدُونَ لِلشَّمْسِ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ وَزَيَّنَ لَهُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ أَعْمَالَهُم. That I found them, her, Bilqis, the queen of Sheba, and her people bowing to the sun, worshiping the sun rather than God. وَزَيَّنَ لَهُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ أَعْمَالَهُم. And Satan has beautified their act for them. In other words, he made it look fair, and it's a foul deed, right? They're worshiping other than the actual creator. They're worshiping his creation rather than him. And Satan made it appear fair to them. So this emotivism, that's exactly what emotivism means. What? Astahsinu hada, astazinu, I see this as being good or hasan or beautiful. And this looks good to me, right? It appears good to my sensibilities. And this is how many modern people, this is how they decide morality. Well, this appears good to my my sentiments. Well, okay, how do you know it really is or not? How do you know that foul things have not just simply been made to appear fair to you by Satan and his, those who are sort of working with him? Yeah. These are realities. I mean, we're not materialists. We believe in these unseen realities, right? There's absolutely, every time in the Qur'an it says the seen and the unseen realm, always the unseen realm comes first, right? It's principial. We see what happens in the world is really the manifestation of unseen principles. The whole world is the manifestation of an unseen creator. We don't see him in this world, right? And things that happen, I mean, even you don't even have to be a believer to appreciate this point. What we do, our actions, are expressions of our inner reality, right? Of who we are, kind of in an immaterial sense.
Yes, we don't see our consciousness. Our consciousness is invisible.
Absolutely, but it's manifested.
And science can't see our thoughts. No scientist ever, no experiment can ever see our thoughts. So this is kind of an example of the unseen affecting the material world.
Right, and then you have Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse, both of these German, I mean, very important figures also, who was 1930s, mostly 30s and 40s, Marcuse a little bit later, really pushed very openly for sexual liberation, even back, starting from the 30s with Reich. These are very dubious figures.
School in the 30s, which the Nazis closed down, but they continued after that. And
exactly, yes. And you really see that there's this radical push. And again, we said that sexuality and sexual norms are very tied to the family, and they were not unaware of that. It was not just like, oh, we want to have fun, and they didn't see the implications. These people were very much against the family. They wanted to destroy the family.
Their names have been associated with what some people call cultural Marxism. It's a particular way of describing this kind of movement in today's world. I mean, yeah. And
then you have a number of other feminist thinkers. I didn't actually put them on here, but you have Simone de Beauvoir, obviously, in France in the 1950s. She comes out with her book. You have Betty Friedan with the feminist mystique. Yeah. You have, Germaine Greer. In the 60s and 70s, you have Shlomit Firestone. There's a whole range. And by the way, people don't realize, you look into these people, really, all these people mentioned, just read their Wikipedia page. You'll be very aghast at about the kind of people they were, how they lived their lives, and so on and so forth. Simone de Beauvoir, who's sort of put forth as this big feminist icon, she and Michel Foucault, who's also practically a prophet to a lot of these kind of modern post-colonial academics and woke, kind of people, right? They campaigned in France to get rid of, to lower the age of sexual consent to include children. Both of them did. They campaigned for pedophilia. And Foucault lived a very dissolute life, morally speaking. And he actually died after catching AIDS at a BDSM-themed bathhouse in San Francisco. It's not as Muslims, okay, it doesn't mean he cannot have insights and critiques, or maybe Simone de Beauvoir. Okay, fine. But the point is we cannot be blind to the fact that, these people's atheism, and de Beauvoir also was a radical atheist, as she grew up in a very conservative Christian family, and she became an atheist, I think, when she was 17 or 18. Germaine Greer, also atheist, by the time she was 18, she talks about this, right? She had a very unfortunate experience, and also just went to school with the nuns in Australia, and they could not answer her questions, and she was kind of rebellious and just said, I'm not having it. But anyway, all right, let's move on. So
yes, let's move on.
All right, so homosexuality in the wake of the sexual revolution. I'm going to very, very fast. I'm not going to talk about. There's a book that came out in 1989. It's called After the Ball: How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s. It was written by two gay men. Marshall Kirk, who was a neuropsychologist, and Hunter Madsen was a social marketing and advertising executive. So look at the, two fields here, a neuropsychologist and a marketing and advertising executive, and they were both Harvard trained. And they basically put together a plan. I'm not saying their one book is the whole reason why things are the way they are, but in 1989, they came out with basically a manifesto. How are we going to get America, and by extension, the rest of at least the Western world, because America is, of course, the peak of its power at that time, right, to basically overcome its rejection of homosexuality and so on and so forth. It's a very fascinating read. It's also a maddening read, I think, if you're a religious believer, because you see that they basically put a plan which was implemented lock, step, and barrel. Everything they said came to be done. And they actually said, I mean, this is quoting from the book. This is their own words. They say, the campaign we outline in this book, though complex, depends centrally upon a program of unabashed propaganda. These are their words, firmly grounded in long-established principles of psychology and advertising. And these are Harvard-educated psychologists and advertising executives. And, one thing they say, one major aspect of this pillar is desensitization. The principle of desensitization builds on people's primal instincts, whereby a flood of gay-related advertising presented in the least offensive fashion possible gets the job done. And then they say, if straights can't shut off the shower, they may at least eventually get used to being wet, right? So this was all very intentional. And then they also say, they talk about conversion, and they say, we mean conversion. Now look at that. I mean, again, straight quote from the book. We mean conversion of the average American's emotions, mind, and will through a planned psychological attack in the form of propaganda fed to the nation via the media.
Wow, it's amazing quotes. Actually, I mean, they could have come straight from hell. I mean, there's a deliberate attempt to subvert, undermine traditional,
deliberate,
quite intentional. You stressed several times they were Harvard educated, so they had the intelligence to promote this, and you say they were very successful.
Right. And I just want to, I want people to also just realize that, again, we should not just naively take the situation that exists around us as just, oh, well, that's what it is, right? Like many Muslims who kind of just parrot what they hear, especially in Western societies, and parrot the discourse and all. It's like, do you realize that your discourse and your entire moral sensibility has literally been crafted by people with a very particular, intention to craft it in a very particular way, right? I'm not saying the whole thing is just these two men, right? But like what they said, and if you read the book, I mean, they say, again, they themselves say there are all of these kind of dysfunctionalities about the gay community, and they critique it themselves. They have like 10 points about all of these things, and they say, we're not going to show that to the public. They say, when you bring, like you're sitting in a tent and you bring the horses, you let the front and you don't let the stinky back in, you leave the stinky.
One of the things that are obvious is something that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has mentioned, is that the anal intercourse, which is the staple diet of this, is extremely dangerous practice, and it's an excellent way to transmit disease as well.
As we learned in the 1980s.
And so this current emphasis on public health and so on, advertising against smoking and so on is all very good, of course, but this one practice gets away scot-free, even though it's an excellent way to spread disease, obviously AIDS, the virus, and other means. So but that's not highlighted or mentioned. That's overlooked completely. So,
right. Okay, so finishing off. So there's another book, which again, I'm just putting on here, A Queer Thing Happened to America, and What a Long, Strange Trip It's Been, by Michael Brown, 2011. This is a big, thick 600 tome, and also it kind of chronicles the last couple decades, and also full of quotes from, sort of gay activists, LGBT, organizations and stuff. And a lot of it is very, very shocking. And it's not stuff you kind of read in the public, but it's things that have been said and written publicly, but are not really, shouted from the rooftop, so to speak. And so you have to dig a little bit. But when you see some of the things that are admitted by people when they're kind of speaking kind of off the record, or even by Madsen and Kirk on the record, like they wrote this book, it really kind of makes you do a double take. And so it's worth, doing that. And one of the resources that we're going to talk about at the end, you can actually get a very good summary in 2 podcast episodes on these 2 books, so you don't have to actually read
good
1,000 pages that they both.
I'm not familiar with these 2 works.
Okay, all right. So very quickly, from Truman's, I have a couple quotes from Truman's book. It says, it is difficult to overestimate the importance of this move to make sexual desire central to human identity. In modern society, everything from the common use of terms such as straight and gay in everyday conversation to the underlying assumptions of international human rights law presupposes that this is the case. That what is the case? That sexual desire is central to human identity, right? That basically our desire is our God. And the idea that human flourishing is virtually synonymous with sexual fulfillment is a commonplace. In fact, virtually an intuition of modern Western culture. So you come and say, well, our religion prohibits particular kind of sexual behavior, but wait a minute, you are prohibiting people from sexual flourishing, which means you are undermining what it means to actually be a human being. Like that's where this sentiment is.
This is the book, actually.
Yes,
just quoted from. Yep. And I have my own copy. Obviously, there is I'm proud to say he's actually a British
yes, he is.
living in the United States, where he is a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. But this is definitely worth reading.
And if you get the audio version, which is what I listen to, both books, he reads it out himself, so you can listen to him read it out in his British accent. Yep. All right. And then the next one, moving right along. If we are at root defined in large part by our sexual desires, if sexual desire or orientation, as we now say, is who we are, right? Not just what we do, but who we are, then sex must be political, because rules governing sexual behavior are rules that govern what is and is not considered by society to be legitimate as an identity. So again, this identity question is absolutely central, and we have to understand the importance of it, and also why as Muslims it is such a problematic category. And then finally, the old chestnut of love the sin or hate the sin simply does not work in a world where the sin is the identity of the sinner, and the two cannot be separated even at a conceptual level. Okay, very, very important here. I'm going to now go faster. I mean, we spent a long time setting the groundwork, but I think it's been important to do this because, again, if people have absorbed what we've been talking about, now we're going to get into Islam and what does Islam say. We've already adumbrated it.
So we're going to look at the Islamic paradigm on sex and sexuality.
And now we have a context in which we can fit that in. And so we can go through this much faster because, of course, this will be familiar to Muslims, but hopefully when people hear this now and see these verses, you'll also see it in a different context, right? Because you've seen, and again, this is going to be uploaded. People can take a break, stop, go have coffee, come back and finish this tomorrow.
Or tea if they're English, but yeah, sorry. Yeah.
You don't have to listen to all of this in one go, right? So yeah, okay. All right, creation of the male and the female. So we're just going to go from the Qur'an, but again, reading it in terms of what we've been talking about. وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, and by his creation of the male and the female. So God created a male and he created a female, right? It's part of his purposeful design in creation. وَأَنَّهُ خَلَقَ الزَّوْجَيْنِ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, and that he created the two mates, the male and the female. So they're mates of each other. They're meant to go together. وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنثَى, and then he says, and the male is not like the female. So men and women are the same in many respects. They're both equally human. They both equally have, the duty to worship God and the ability to develop themselves morally and spiritually and to, earn the pleasure of God and to earn paradise and so forth, right? But there are many respects in which men and women are different physically, emotionally, psychologically, and so on and so forth. Statistically, of course, individuals are very different, men and women, but statistically speaking, there are things that are dominant in males, things are dominant in females. This is known. It's very not politically correct to sort of speak in these terms today, but the science is there.
A lot of research, Jordan.
Yeah, of course, it's there, but you're just not allowed to
YouTube videos. Yeah.
You just have to pretend it doesn't exist, right? Because it's not politically correct. So, but we know as Muslim, وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنثَى, the male is not like the female. So we're fine with that. We know it's true both by revelation and by just, observation and our experience of the world. And then this longer verse, I'll just read it in English for the sake of time. And of his signs is that he created for you from yourselves mates, that you may find tranquility in them, and he placed between you affection and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for people who reflect. And then, O mankind, fear your Lord. We hear this in the khutbah every Friday. O mankind, fear your Lord, who created you from one soul and created from it its mate and dispersed from both of them many men and women, right? Ya ayyuhan nasu taqu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum min nafsin wahida wa khalaqa minha zawjaha wa batha minhuma rijalan kathiran wa nisaa. I just say that because every Muslim, even if they don't know Arabic, they'll recognize that phrase because, always the khutbah starts with it on Friday. Other verses, we have the beautiful verse in the Qur'an, right? About here, the parity, the spiritual parity between men and women. Surely men who submit to Allah and women who submit to Allah, men who have faith and women who have faith, men who are obedient and women who are obedient, men who are truthful and women who are truthful, men who are steadfast and women who are steadfast, men who humble themselves to God and women who humble themselves to God or Allah, men who give alms and women who give alms, men who fast and women who fast, men who guard their chastity and women who guard their chastity, men who remember Allah much and women who remember Allah much, right? 10 different qualities, men who do it and women who do it. For them has Allah prepared forgiveness and a mighty reward. Beautiful. And then we have the believing men and believing women are allies of one another. They enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and establish prayer and give zakat and obey Allah and His Messenger. Those Allah will have mercy upon them. Indeed, Allah is exalted in might and wise. Right? So men and women, they are meant to be allies of one another, that they are constantly enjoining each other, but to what? To just following their whims? No, they're enjoining each other to what is right and forbidding what is wrong, right? And coming together and forming communities that exalt the divine standards of right and wrong, and try to, give people a greater ability to realize that moral goal in their lives, that moral standard, and to develop themselves by doing so. And they establish prayer and give zakat, right? And then another verse, and this is more than one verse like this in the Qur'an: whoever works righteousness, man or woman, right, or male or female, min dhakarin aw untha, and has faith, verily to him will we give a new life, a life that is good and pure, and we will bestow on such their reward according to the best of their actions, right? So we have this beautiful parity, complementarity between men and women, and this parity also, right, on this level. However, laysa dhakaru kal untha, the male is not like the female. And so we do see that in the practical life of how men and women interact in society, the roles that each one predominantly is meant to play, right, and the way they are meant to complement each other, they are not treated the same because they're not created the same. And so men are the protectors and maintainers of women. Qawwamuna ala nisa. This is how Yusuf Ali translated it, protectors and maintainers. Anyway, there's a big discussion on exactly what this means, and of course it's very controversial today. Yeah. Yeah, but I'm just saying this, so those men are the protector, or qawamun ala the women, whatever qawamun, again, but men have a particular role to play vis-a-vis women because God has given the one more than the other. He says strength, but again, there's a lot of discussion as to what the more is, and because they support them from their means. And then in another verse, Surah Al-Baqarah, and women have rights similar to the rights against them according to what is equitable, but men have a degree over them, degree of advantage. Again, this is a gloss here, and God is exalted in power and wise. Again, there can be a whole discussion on, the exact rights and duties of men and women. Men and women have the same rights and duties in certain respects. They also have, men have some rights that women don't have. Women have some rights that men don't have. Women have a right to be supported financially their entire lives. Men don't have that right. They have to support themselves. Men take on certain leadership roles that women don't take, like head of the household, paradigmatically speaking, also religious leadership, like leading prayer and so forth, right? So there are distinctions there. So there are areas of overlap and areas of distinction. This is fine because laysa dhakaru kal untha, and it all balances out in equity according to the wisdom of the Creator from an Islamic perspective. And so the difference in complementary nature of the male and the female, as we read, men and women are not the same. Right? There are there's an obvious biological complementarity between male and female bodies and reproductive systems, as we've been talking about. There is purpose. Again, this goes back to what we've said. Now it all falls into place. Purpose is inherent to the body and its functions as created by God. It's not for us to decide or assign on our own. People say, well, who cares what you do if you're a quote unquote, dangly bits and all? No, I mean, the things have a purpose. You either use them for that purpose or you don't use them, right? But they are to be directed the way they were meant to be directed by God. Again, with the more latitude that the Islamic tradition provides in terms of, rapport between husband and wife. Also, pleasure is, not every act, like in the Catholic Church, at least every single sexual act has to be at least potentially open to conception. That's not true in Islam. I mean, a man and woman, they can enjoy themselves also just for pleasure. When the woman is menstruating, they're not allowed to have intercourse, but they're allowed to have other types of, pleasurable activity, right? So there is sort of this, notion that, but again, these are the limits that God has placed, right? He's allowed this within this parameter. It's not stricter than that, but it's also not, wider than that, or the other way, it's not wider, it's also not stricter. So this idea that my body, my choice, this has nothing to do with an Islamic perspective. God's body in the end of the day, they're on loan to us. He created them. And you can choose whether to obey him or not to your own advantage or disadvantage, respectively, but it's not up to us to make up the rules or to impose our own meaning onto things, because we do believe that they do have the meaning that's been imparted up to them by their Creator, because we're not atheists and we're not materialists and we're not deists either. And so we believe that, all of creation has a purpose. Our bodies have a purpose. Our souls have a purpose. Our creation as human beings has a purpose. Our creation as men and women separately also has a purpose, right? And so this is very central. Complementarity and disposition, or khilqa, masculine versus feminine traits. Fathers and mothers are not interchangeable. There are religious rules for men and others for women. We talked about this even in prayer, even where you wouldn't think it would be relevant. Like, men are supposed to stand more like apart when they're praying, women more contracted. Why? Well, because men, laysa dhakaru kal untha, right? Women are more contracted, men more expansive. That's just how they stand in the prayer and how they make the sujood, the prostration. So even in very minute, the Sharia is thoroughly gendered from start to finish, which is why I said earlier, the contemporary scene, race, gender, and sexual orientation is all one. We say no. Race, Islam makes no distinction between race. And it says in the Qur'an that, among his signs are the creation of, that the difference in your tongues and your colors are a sign of God, right? So absolutely no race distinction whatsoever, right? And the Prophet is very explicit, peace be upon him, that an Arab is not superior to a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab to an Arab, right? And a white man is not superior to a black man, nor a black man to a white man, except by way of piety and fear of God, right? So complete, I'm not saying there's no racism among Muslims, but in Islam, right, this is something that, races are all considered equal, right? Gender, equally valid and equally valuable. Men are not better than women, women are not better than men, but they are different. And so the Sharia treats them differently, and the gender distinctions are pervasive. So it's a thoroughly gendered tradition. So this idea of moving towards this androgynous norm where men and women are just all the same and there's no boundaries, this is completely against, just the heart of Islam. You have to throw the entire religion out the window to incorporate this type of thing, right? So we can't get on board with this kind of radical gender egalitarianism, which sees mathematical sameness and equality, and we will not rest until 50% of all CEOs and all companies are women, and 50% of all nurses and all hospitals are men. That's never going to happen, by the way, except through very coercive
social engineering. And Jordan Peterson, who speaks on this subject frequently, has an excellent, he's obviously a scientist, a clinical psychologist, and has a range of data. All the data speaks against this position that you're criticizing as well. And there you go. You were about to say it now. Okay.
Showing all sorts of physiological, psychological, and dispositional differences between men and women, though this is taboo to say today because it goes against, the zeitgeist and notions of social constructionism and certain, gender ideologies and so forth. So anyway, the nature of morality and ethics in Islam, this is very important. We've touched on it. So again, hopefully we can go through it quickly, but this is really important for the latter part of the discussion, which we are finally getting to, sexual norms and then homosexuality specifically, and then we'll be wrapping up, hopefully, inshallah. So where does morality come from, right? Where does it come from? In the West, you've had deontological ethics. Back when religion was more prominent, this notion that moral behavior was largely a question of doing your moral duty, and the moral duty was often, seen as coming from God and divine command, right? And this is kind of natural within a theistic universe. And so this is also, for Muslims, is very fundamental. God's command is absolutely fundamental, and we mentioned this before. And I also mentioned the verse, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have created jinn and mankind but to worship me, right? And then it is God and his messenger, Allah and his messenger alone, right, for the Muslim, who are legislators of what is right and wrong, permitted and prohibited. This is not our prerogative as human beings, either collectively to say we just sort of extemporaneously exposit a rational morality, or let alone, even more so, our individual. This is the motto. Well, what do you think of this? Where do you stand on premarital sex? It's not it's nothing to do with what you your opinion doesn't matter.
It's above our pay grade. These questions are above our pay grade. We refer them up.
Exactly. Yeah.
Who has the authority to make these judgments. So don't ask me. Ask the one who made us.
Because when you do it, you get people like legalizing child pornography in the 1970s. Right? Yeah. That's what happens when you just leave people. And so this is a very critical verse, right? I'll just read it in English again for the sake of time. It is not for any believing man or woman, when Allah and his messenger have decided on an affair, to have any choice in their matter. Okay, and the word, أن يكون لهم الخيارة من أمرهم, خيار من اختيار, خيار choice. And this is the fetish of the modern world, choice. Well, I chose. Did you choose? Why do you wear hijab? Well, I chose to. Everything comes down to choice. It's legitimate if you chose it. It's not legitimate if you didn't choose. This strikes at the heart of that, right? Not believing for any believing man or woman, not appropriate, right? Or becoming for any believing man or woman when God and his messenger have decided on an affair to have any choice in their matter. And whoever disobeys God and his messenger, or Allah and his messenger, has manifestly gone astray. This verse just completely, shatters that myth, right? That if God and his messenger have decided on an affair, that's it. It's their prerogative, God's, and obviously the messenger only is obeying the command of his Lord. So it's really God in the end, right? Now you can disobey, go ahead, but you're disobeying. You can't make up your own morality. You can either obey God's morality or disobey it and, reap the consequences of either choice, but it's not your prerogative to make it up. So that's one, divine command, absolutely fundamental for us as Muslims. That cannot be lost from any discussion that we have as Muslims, particularly internally, when it comes to questions of sex, sexual immorality, or anything. Number two, consequences matter. So there is a type of consequentialism which becomes the dominant ethical theory in the modern world in the 19th and 20th centuries through people like first Jeremy Bentham, then John Stuart Mill, right? Moral action is that which brings the greatest benefit for the greatest number, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So
utilitarianism, as it's called.
Right. So we have kind of in a sense, I wouldn't like to say it this way, but there's sort of a divine utilitarianism in the sense that God is wise, just, and merciful, and he legislates for us what is best for us, both in this world and the next, from his omniscient perspective. Allahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun. God knows and you don't know. So consequences matter, but it's not just the consequences that we, in our limited perspective, fixate upon. It's in a larger, and we'll see in another slide or two that there are maqasid of the Sharia. There are goals that the Sharia is trying to uphold for the benefit in this world and the next of human beings, right? So that's a type of consequentialism, but it's the one that is a divine consequentialism that God has set and that he has legislated also the means of achieving it. And then the third thing, and this is the third mainstream also in Western, historically, is virtue ethics, which goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? In which Muslims also took on Aristotle's writings on ethics very enthusiastically and modified it and improved it and sort of infused it with, the telos of revelation and the spirit of, and improved upon it. But they found what he said about ethics quite compatible. And the idea is that virtue and moral character are also of paramount importance, right? The notion of khuluq or akhlaq, the Prophet God's, we read in the Qur'an, Allah says, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, speaking to the Prophet, you you have a noble or a magnificent moral character, right? And even the word virtue is like, McIntyre has like after virtue. That's why he called it that, because there's no virtue left. We don't talk about it. The word is so old fashioned. And virtue is like gets a chuckle, like virtue, like what is that, right? But the Prophet said, peace be upon him, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ, I was sent but to perfect the noble traits of character. So your character matters. There are things like, for example, hasad, which is envy. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said that envy eats up good deeds like fire eats wood. And envy means that you are so jealous of what someone has that you don't have, to the extent that you want that person to lose that benefit if you cannot enjoy it yourself. So it's one thing to say, oh, look at the benefit that person has. I wish I had that. But it's another thing to say, I actually, willfully desire that he should lose that benefit because I can't stand to see someone, enjoy it if I can't enjoy it. This is very ugly. And this is not even acting on. It's not like I'm going and sabotaging, like, keying his brand new Mercedes. Like, I'm not doing it. But just in my heart, I have that hasad. In that state of the heart, the Prophet said that state eats up your good deeds. So your noble, your character matters, right? And your virtue matters. And then the Prophet also said, very important for us as Muslims, peace be upon him, every religion has a characteristic moral trait. لِكُلِّ دِينٍ خُلُقٍ وَخُلُقُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاء. And the characteristic trait of Islam is modesty, haya, right? And then finally, to round this off, he said, if you have no shame or modesty, then do as you please. إِذَا لَمْ تَسْتَحْيِ فَاصْنَعْ مَا شِئْتَ. Okay. How does this compare with the contemporary moral and ethical discourse? Where does divine command fit in the current moral discourse in the modern secular West? Well, it's irrelevant. right? There's no God. God is dead, Nietzsche told us, right? And the West has been secularizing for centuries. So sexual morality is separated from religion. We saw at the beginning, becomes thoroughly personal and subjective. That's true of all morality. It becomes a question of emotivism and, personal taste and so forth, right? You have the centrality of these sort of ersatz notions, like replacement notions or replacing religion. So freedom, we talked about, right? This kind of fetishization of personal autonomy, whereas Islam is based on servitude and submission to God. This notion of autonomy, right? If you know what it means, auto is self, nomos is a law. Autonomy literally means, and this was Kant who really talked a lot about autonomy, it means to give oneself the law. Any Muslim can immediately feel, once you translate it, how blasphemous that is. Because God is the lawgiver, right? He's the Sharia, the lawgiver, and the Sharia is his way, his law, right? We don't give ourselves the law. This is to make gods of ourselves, literally, right? So God and his messenger alone have the right to legislate, as we saw in that verse, right? That when God and his messenger have decided upon a matter, it is not for a believing man or a woman to have a say in it. And then this notion of authenticity we talked about, we would say as Muslims in response to that, yes, we want to be authentic, but we are only our true authentic selves as human beings when we have found and submitted to our Creator, because that is the objective, inherent purpose with which he has created all human beings. As the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, every human being was born on the fitrah, right? And so coming back to your internal nature and submitting to your Creator, that is the homecoming of every single human being. If they don't realize it, they don't realize it's to their own detriment. But that is everyone's true homecoming, is back to God. And so consequences, so divine command, we says irrelevant in the modern, ethical and moral discourse. What about consequences? Well, again, consequentialism, utilitarianism is the dominant ethical theory, right? But the consequences are judged in purely subjective terms, if at all, and also in purely material and in this worldly terms. It's a secular notion of which consequences really matter. And we would say that Allah knows our interests better than we do, and he alone has full knowledge of all consequences, and those consequences are related both to this world and to the next world as well. And then finally, virtue and moral character. We talked about virtue as an old-fashioned and quaint term in modern parlance. Sexual behavior is seen as irrelevant to moral character, right? You can do whatever you want sexually as long as it was consensual. No one sees that as having any impact on your moral character. It's just considered totally irrelevant because sex doesn't have any meaning anymore. It doesn't have any moral meaning either. There's no moral kind of code or norm attached to it, as we said, right? And so this also downplaying of virtue and of moral character, right? This, again, the Quran refutes this. إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. He says in the Quran, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ. The day of judgment is that day on which neither wealth nor progeny will avail a person, right? Except for one who comes with a sound heart. The only thing that will avail you on that day is coming to God with a sound heart, right? Okay. All right, so Islamic sexual and gender norms. Again, we'll try to just speed through this. Again, hopefully this will be familiar to Muslims, but who knows, in the modern age and contemporary society, a lot of Muslims surprisingly don't even know some of the basic Islamic rulings on certain of these issues. So hopefully this will be a beneficial, experience for our viewers, right? So we talked already about the centrality of sexual norms to any society and moral system, so I won't repeat that. Sexual norms in the Sharia are tied to family and to family law, right? Because again, sex is reproductive and the family is the absolute most important social institution. And so, legislation surrounding sexuality is absolutely paramount, and it is part and parcel of our religion. It's not negotiable. It's not something we say, oh, well, we believe in one God, but we can just change all the sexual norms. No, this lies at the very heart of the religion, right? And that's because of the centrality of the family and therefore of sex and sexual morality to the faith, right? Mm-hmm. So as every Muslim hopefully should know, sex outside of marriage, which is called Zina, is strictly forbidden, haram, and it constitutes a major sin, kabira, right? There are major sins and, not less major sins. And Zina, which is sexual intercourse between a man and a woman who are not bound by a, Islamically valid contract of marriage, is a major sin, right? Why? It undermines one of the fundamental objectives or maqasid of the Sharia, which are 5 or 6 actually: the protection of religion, the protection of life, the protection of lineage and family, which is where the prohibition of extramarital sex comes in, the protection of property, protection of intellect, and the protection of honor. These are the 6 overriding objectives that the scholars looked at the rulings of the Sharia, the divine legislation, and said, these are the 6 fundamental categories that are necessary for human beings to flourish, all human beings to flourish in this world and in the next world, that these 6 fundamental things have to be protected. And one of them we see is lineage. And to protect lineage and the sanctity and integrity of the family structure, sexuality must be tightly confined to it. And so the rules regarding extramarital intercourse are actually very strict and very severe, because it's considered not only a sin, but also a social crime, right? That's potentially adjudicable, can potentially be punished in a court of law. It's very difficult to implement certain of the stiffer penalties, but conceptually, we don't have this notion, okay, my sexual behavior is just my own private affair. No, that's modern secular individualism. It's not Islam. It's not realistic either, because our sexual behavior it has ripple effects, and it does affect society, and it affects many other people other than ourselves. And so Islam recognizes that and legislates accordingly. What are the consequences of zina, so extramarital sex? So the main reason the scholars say this has been prohibited is because it leads to the mixing of lineage, what they call khalt al-ansab, that you're mixing lineage and you're obscuring, who belongs to whom and to what family. And this is considered fundamental for our identity as human beings and also for our social relationships. So many rights and duties in traditional societies and in Islam, devolve upon a person through their actual blood relations. And so it's very important for me to know, if I'm a man, is this my child or not that I have to spend on, right? Who do I inherit from? I inherit from my relatives. I have to know who they are, right? And families, again, a lot of studies on this, even by Western secular anthropologists and scientists and others, about how we naturally prefer our own kind of lineage over those who are outside of it, right? This is natural. It's part of the fitrah that we've been created with. So consequences of zina, premarital sex, right? We didn't get to homosexuality yet. It's an aspect of it, but even between men and women, it undermines the institution of marriage, which leads to the breakdown of the family unit, and by extension, the breakdown of society. So it's massive consequence, not just a personal issue. And also, right, beyond the pragmatic and sort of sociological repercussions, it has grave consequences for one's personal virtue, one's moral character, and one's standing before Allah. And all of these are relevant to us and important, right? And they determine our state on the day of judgment and in our eternal afterlife, right? And so norms for minimizing zina, how does Islam attempt to legislate in order to minimize the occurrence of zina and make it a realizable moral norm for the average man and woman to actually avoid non-marital intercourse? Well, as we read in the Qur'an, and tell the believing men to lower their gaze and to guard their private parts. And then it goes on and tell the believing women to lower their gaze and guard their private parts. So, not looking at other people with sexual lust, and also covering our bodies and maintaining modesty. We saw before 2-3 slides earlier that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said every religion has a characteristic moral trait, and the characteristic trait of Islam is modesty. So Muslims are known for their very intense sense of modesty. Also, no physical contact between non-mahrams, meaning a man and woman who are not so closely related that they could not marry. So any woman who's not your mother or sister or whatever, you should have no physical contact if you're not actually married to her or a close relative. So there's not premarital sex in Islam, there's no premarital physical contact at all. That's the actual ruling. It can sometimes be difficult, especially handshakes and so forth, but this is the principle. Also, no khalwa between mahrams, which means a man and a woman who are not closely related, they should not be alone in an isolated place where they fear unannounced intrusion, okay? And the idea is not that, Muslims think every time a man and woman are alone together, they're just going to hit the floor and lose control. But the idea is that you are putting yourself in temptation's way. And, it's a very volatile aspect of human life. And when you open yourself to that temptation, sometimes it just comes and gets you from where you least expect it, and you fall. You think you're in control, and you can completely lose control and can be very dangerous. Also, modest dress, speech, and behavior for both men and women. So these are the norms, right? Is zina the only thing that's forbidden in the realm of sexuality? So there's a ruling or a principle actually in Islamic law which says all things are permissible by default. Al-aslu fil ashya' al-ibaha, that everything that a human being could do is by default permissible unless revelation has come and specifically prohibited it. But when it comes to sexuality and sexual behavior, it's the opposite principle. Sexual matters are forbidden by default. They're haram unless they're specifically permitted. So sexual behavior by default is not permitted, and except where it has been specifically legislated and permitted. And where is that? Sexual relations between a man and a woman bound by an Islamically valid contract of marriage. It says in the Qur'an, except your spouses and those whom your right hands possess. In our day, this category doesn't exist. It's spouses. So I put here, valid contract of marriage, right? Valid, Islamically valid contract, marriage contract between a man and a woman. So what is prohibited? Everything else, okay? So if you're not man and woman, you're not married, then any sexual activity, or if you're obviously two men or two women, you can't be a man and a woman married if you're two men and two women, right? So everything else would be prohibited. Sexual acts short of intercourse, right? If you're not within that relationship. Anal intercourse, categorically prohibited, even between a man and a woman in marriage.
That prohibition on liwat or anal intercourse is for all people, not just for gays. It's for
exactly, absolutely. It's a blanket prohibition, right? The rectal cavity is not the place where the male organ was designed to go. Period. I mean, again, we believe these things were designed with a purpose.
It's common sense when you think about it, but yeah, indeed.
Right. It's not meant to go there, and it's considered a gross misuse of the body to put it there, and so it's not permitted even between a husband and wife. And then exposing one's aura or one's private parts to other than one's spouse without need, such as medical and so forth. And we know the aura for the man is from the navel to the knee. And for the woman, there's different levels of it, all of the body except the face and hands in front of non-marriageable males, a more relaxed aura in front of family members and women and so forth. But the idea is that you cover your body, especially your primary sex organs, you don't uncover them except in it for need, right? So Muslims don't have, are not supposed to have like open kind of locker rooms and people walking around naked and so forth. This would be considered a breach of Islamic morals and etiquette. Masturbation, according to the majority, also prohibited. So solo sex. So the idea here is that sex is meant to be somehow by design to be inherently heterosexual, obviously, men and women, but also inherently interactive, right? And so engaging in sexual behavior by oneself, according to the majority, right, there's some discussion about it, is also prohibited, right? Obviously, this has nothing to do with consent because, actions like that are obviously consensual. I mean, Zina also is consensual. So this modern fixation on consent is not relevant. I'm not saying you can force someone to have sex with you. But I'm just saying the presence of consent does not render a sexual act licit if it's otherwise prohibited. That would be ridiculous. And so in addition, anything that leads systematically, or that systematically threatens to lead to illicit relations, like touching, gazing, with the eyes, khalwa, being alone, with a person of the opposite sex, immodest speech, dress or behavior, all of these things are also prohibited because they can lead down this very slippery slope. And it says in the Quran, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. It doesn't just say don't commit zina, it says don't even come close to zina, don't even get near it, right? What does it mean in the Sharia to protect family and lineage, right? Again, I sort of said this, extended family is normative. So consider inheritance laws. A person dies, you can bequeath 1/3 of your wealth to non-heirs, but then the rest of it devolves upon your close relatives according to predetermined shares. So your wealth resorts to its rightful owner, which is God, and then it's redistributed amongst your close relatives according to the standards of revelation, right? Which is also why it's important, who am I related to? Who has a right in my inheritance, or to whose inheritance do I have a right? These are important questions. Blood ties through lineage, and therefore natural reproduction is of prime importance. This is very critical. Consequently, and this is important too, the prohibition of most means of artificial reproduction are prohibited in Islam as being tantamount to zina. Now, this doesn't make sense from a Western perspective. Why? So what does this mean? A man and a woman are married, okay? The woman has healthy eggs, the man has healthy sperm, but maybe her fallopian tubes are blocked, so the sperm can't get to the egg, so they can't conceive naturally. In this case, a married man and a woman, healthy eggs, healthy sperm, she carries the baby. In this case alone, the doctor can artificially inseminate by the majority and implant the baby, the zygote in the woman. She carries the baby and gives birth to it. So the doctor helped, but what? The baby's born of a married mother and father, and his biological mother also carried him. This is the natural way. This is the way that God set up for humans to reproduce. That cannot be breached. So sperm donor from outside the couple, egg donor from outside the couple, surrogate mother, all of these are prohibited because they are seen as bringing about the effects of zina by crossing lineage and blurring natural family lines. And one thing that's relevant to this discussion, we often hear, because technology now allows for this kind of artificial reproduction, right? Technology is never its own moral argument. It's never, just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should. And whether we do or do not use technology or use it in a particular way comes back to your moral system. And for us as Muslims, the Sharia is our moral system. And it allows me to be sitting in Boston, you in London, and we're conversing using this modern technology. No scholar would say this is a problem. But it doesn't, but because we have the ability to artificially reproduce, right? Here they say, no, the Sharia, this is a central domain of it, and it forbids this type of tampering with the natural reproductive sunnah that Allah has set up in human reproduction. This is life itself. You can't play with this. And in our society, many people say, well, technology has basically flattened the playing field between gay and straight couples, because now you can have gay marriages or lesbian, and they can just have artificial means of reproduction, have their own families. We say, no, those means of reproduction are forbidden, even for heterosexual couples. So the fact that you're trying to justify these new arrangements based on that technology, well, that technology, we don't even accept it to begin with. So it's not an argument in your favor, at least from our perspective, right? Further Islamic principles related to gender. There are two genders. Many verses in the Qur'an, وَأَنَّهُ خَلَقَ الزَّوْجَيْنِ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, we saw he created the male and the female. There is this notion of an intersex person born physiologically with ambiguous gender. This has been known since time eternal. And the Sharia talks about that. This is not psychological gender dysphoria, which is different. Someone who has an unambiguously male or female body is considered by the Sharia to be a male or female, a man or a woman accordingly. So biological sex and psychological gender, this distinction which came about in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, this is not something that we as Muslims, would run with, right? This idea that your biological sex and your psychological gender, okay, they might be disparate, but normatively they should line up. These are not free-floating variables. And we said this earlier, if you're male, have a male body, the norm is that you would actually identify as a man. Now, maybe you don't, that's gender dysphoria, that's gender identity disorder. We can deal with that, but it doesn't mean that there is no sort of normative connection between the physical body and the psychological gender, right? Now, something also very important, and this, is going to be uncomfortable for many contemporary Muslims, especially in the West, deliberate imitation of the opposite sex is forbidden, specifically in dress and affectations. And there's a famous hadith, which is narrated in several different variations, that actually not God has cursed, but that the Prophet said the Prophet cursed men who deliberately imitate women and women who deliberately imitate men. Okay. Now, what does this mean, deliberately imitate? It's very important that we understand deliberately imitating, because there can be men, and Islam is realistic, there can be men who are more effeminate by nature in their speech, in their mannerisms, in the way they behave. There could be women who are kind of more masculine by nature. This is not what's being talked about here. It's the ones who deliberately imitate, who take on by design the characteristics that are known in a particular society to belong to the other sex. So
the example earlier on with you, those drag queens that go into schools.
Yeah, drag queen story hour, exactly.
Really dressed up in the most outrageous women's clothes, and that is very deliberate because it's completely unnatural. I mean, it's very artificial, but that would be right. An example of deliberately imitating women, or a certain very crude and exaggerated imitation of women. I don't think any normal woman would look like that, but anyway, so that's
exactly
an example. Yeah,
right. And the idea is that you can always, decide how you dress, right? You might not be able to control your gait or your mannerisms or your speech, but you can always choose what to wear. And so actually Al-Bukhari, one of the main hadith collectors, he put this hadith in the chapter on dress in his book. So this was understood as really, again, things that you can consciously control. So what about those who fall outside of this binary, right? And so this comes up again. These are real, and we're going to get into this now very shortly. These are real conditions that people might, we said they might actually feel psychologically not in line with the body, right? So what do we do about this? So we say sex, gender identity and expression, and sexual orientation should normatively line up. In other words, they are quote unquote meant to line up. That is the normal thing, right? And it is the normative thing. So this genderbread person, which we'll see again in a minute, right, where gender, sex, male, female, gender, man, woman, sexual orientation, gay, straight, gender expression, masculine, feminine. These are all considered like 4 free-floating variables. They may or may not match up, and you can mix and match however you want, and they're all equally normatively fine. We would say no, right? Normatively, they should all line up, but we understand that for some people they won't, and people are not morally responsible for that to the extent that it's not something that they have chosen or brought about on themselves, right? So exceptions to the rule, like misalignment, do not undermine the rule itself. That is the normativity of things like what? The normativity of the male-female gender binary, absolutely central to the way God has created us as human beings, as he says in the Qur'an, right? Also, it does not undermine the normativity of the expectation of broad conformity to the behavioral norms, dress, and mannerisms of one's natal sex or gender, right? And we're not allowed to imitate the opposite sex willfully, right? And it also does not undermine the normativity of opposite sex attraction and within marriage, opposite sex sexual expression. Doesn't mean everyone necessarily falls into that, but the fact that some people might not be attracted to the opposite sex and they might be attracted to their own sex, that doesn't undermine the normativity of opposite sex attraction. So does that make Islam quote unquote heteronormative? Yes, obviously. We would not consider that a term of abuse, but it's used as one. And
it'd be a virtue rather than
other than
good.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Now, very important question. And again, we are wrapping up. So Paul, I can tell, I know you've been traveling, so I'm sorry to go on for so long.
No, this is extremely helpful and useful. Please continue.
Am I sinful for feeling attracted to my own sex or not identifying with my own gender, right? Am I sinful just for having those feelings, whether it's I'm attracted to my own gender, erotically or sexually, or I don't, identify with my actual sex, right? There's a key Islamic principle, and this is very important, especially for people who are, not as familiar with how these issues play out in people's actual lives, right? Key Islamic principle: you are morally responsible only for what you have control over, right? La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha, that God does not burden a soul with greater than it can bear. You are not called to account for what you don't have control over. So if you are, despite yourself, you find that you are attracted to your own sex, right? You are not responsible for those feelings to the extent that you did not choose those. And people who experience that generally don't choose that. It's not something you choose. It's something that you kind of experience and you discover within yourself. So you're not morally responsible just for having those feelings, right? Doesn't mean that, okay, you fantasize and you have ways, and then you can live in ways that might, encourage, right? That's different. Those are things you're choosing to do. But just the very kind of base fact that, okay, I discovered when I became a teenager that, I'm erotically attracted to my own sex rather than the other sex. This does not make you a evil person or a sinful Muslim or let alone a non-Muslim. Of course not. You're not, if you don't have control over it, you're not morally responsible. However, right? So merely experiencing same-sex attractions or gender identity disorder or dysphoria does not constitute a sin. And this, as far as I know, is sort of agreed upon. I mean, all scholars would agree with this. However, right, we are still responsible for our actions because you choose your actions, specifically refraining from haram sexual behavior, right? Or deliberate imitation or impersonation of the opposite sex, right? Cross-dressing, socially transitioning to the other sex, chemically or surgically transitioning also. These are, by consensus of Muslim scholars, Sunni Muslim scholars, are forbidden. There is some difference of opinion within Shiite circles based on a fatwa given by the late Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the Iranian Revolution, who died in 1989. Many Shiite scholars don't accept that, that permission, but there is some discussion there. But among Sunni scholars, there is a consensus that gender transitioning is prohibited. It doesn't mean there's not a recognition that people can have gender dysphoria, but it means that it is not permissible to try to deal with that by changing the body. And so this genderbread person, I told you we would meet him again, and I already talked about it. So sexual orientation, heterosexual, homosexual, it's a scale, biological sex, female, male, intersex, right, is real. There is the intersex condition has been dealt with in the Sharia. Gender expression, you can be either feminine in your expression, masculine, or androgynous. Gender identity, woman, man, genderqueer. And these are, children are being taught this now, right? So your sex is your gonads, like, your genitalia, basically. Orientation is who you're attracted to, and romantically and sexually, that's in your heart. Identity is how you identify in your brain as a man or a woman, and your gender expression is, the body, how you interact and present. And again, the Sharia regulates this. It's not up to you as a person to just kind of, again, take this to the psychologization of the South. Well, I feel this internally, therefore I'm an inauthentic person unless I'm allowed to just do this, right? And if you don't accept me as a Muslim community, and you don't accept my gender expression or my gender identity or my sexual orientation, i.e. acting upon it in ways that are, well, you've undermined my dignity, right? And that's sort of how that moral discourse goes. We say, no. That's not what our conception of the human being is based on to begin with. You're importing a completely foreign ideology and a completely foreign worldview into Islam. Okay. I'm not going to, I already talked about this a little bit. When it comes to gender nonconformity, right, and we are really almost done here. When it comes to gender nonconformity, scholars recognize that there is a conventional component, right, a component to what counts as male versus female, dress, interests, behavior. There is some socially, quote unquote, socially kind of influenced or socially constructed component, but nevertheless, all societies differentiate between males and females. So if I go back to 18th century America and look at the way the founding fathers of this country dressed, they had these big frilly wigs, like long curly hair, these frilly blouses and tights, like stockings. And for us, if you dress that way, they're going to think you're dressed in drag. That's very feminine for us today. But in their time, that's how men dressed. So that's conventional. But that's not how women dressed at their time. The women there, there's very billowing like dresses and whatever. So the men and women dressed differently. They didn't dress the same. Even in our age, even this like unisex, like I'm wearing what I'm wearing and what you're wearing is clearly men's clothing. Woman's blouse is always cut like curved and, it's always different. Like men and women are not the same. Right. So there's some cultural component to that, but the idea is that whatever is largely generally recognized as being masculine or feminine in your society, you're actually bound in the Sharia to sort of conform to that. Well, can I just be my own autonomous individual and throw off the shackles of society? No. That's Rousseau. That's the 19th century. That's secular European psychologization of the self and radical autonomy and individual. That's not Islam, right? So choose your paradigm, choose your religion. But, don't try to mix the two. They're not the same. Dress, as we said, strictly forbidden on the basis of the hadith quoted, to imitate the opposite sex in dress, accoutrements, etc., as conventionally recognized in one society. What about mannerisms? I'm a male, I have a high voice, or I kind of have effeminate, walk or, hand movements, right? The scholars actually, again, this is a phenomenon. We see this in society, right? A man could be even heterosexual, but kind of effeminate, right? Or a woman could be kind of masculine. All right, scholars recognize that a person could have gender atypical mannerisms, gait, voice, etc. The man would be called mukhannath, right? That's a male with effeminate mannerisms, and a woman, mudhakkara, a female with masculine mannerisms. What did the scholars say about this, right? They said these mannerisms, they could be either khilqi, which means constitutional, like the person's it's natural to that person, or it could be affected, like they're taking it on, they're purposely doing it. We know if it's purposeful, then that's forbidden. We've already seen that, right? So purposely affecting such mannerisms is haram by consensus. However, if it comes to somebody naturally, right, effeminate tendencies to a man or sort of more masculine, to a woman, right? The scholars here have differed. Some of them said that the person should try to recondition himself or herself, try to make reasonable efforts to bring their behavior more in line with what's typical of their sex. And if they don't try to, then they're sinful for not trying. But if they try to and they can't do it after a reasonable effort, then the blame drops and, that's fine. Okay. Other scholars said they're not even obligated to even attempt. As long as it came to them naturally and they didn't deliberately do it, they don't have to. It would normally make your life probably easier, just socially speaking, especially for a man. There's a particular stigma in most societies against effeminate men often. It'd probably make one's life easier, to kind of rehabituate. If possible, some people might find that very difficult. And if they do, then they're actually not blamed for that and they should not be made fun of. It would actually be haram to do that. They should not be categorized as being any particular way, or it should not be assumed that they engage in particular sexual behavior like same-sex behavior just because they might appear as feminine, right? This is all dhann, which is kind of suspicious thinking of someone, and this is actually haram. to have that in Islam. Okay, interests and behavior. Islam is not super prescriptive when it comes to things like personal likes and dislikes, right? Girls being more into sports or bricolage, boys being interested in music and art or cooking. Okay, it might not be that typical of your sex, but as long as the activity itself is not forbidden, there is no particular stigma. One can pursue one's interests, so there is a latitude there. And the Sunnah has lots of examples of things that in our society, modern West or whatever, we might consider out of character. Men crying profusely, right? Also, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was not above domestic tasks in 7th century Arabia, sweeping the floor, mending his own socks, right? We don't say, oh, that's just women's work. Well, okay, maybe more typically, but it doesn't mean that, it's beneath a man, for example. Our Prophet, peace be upon him, did this, right? Important, we don't have an ideal of womanhood that is akin to the Victorian notion of the kind of dainty, delicate, fainting female, so frail and weak and whatever. We don't really see that in Islam. Okay, men and women aren't the same. Men in general are stronger than women physically. Obviously that's not really disputable, but this idea that women are these kind of fragile porcelain, kind of fainting, this is not really, even in the West, you could say that's, localizable to particular time periods and cultures, but, we don't have this in Islam. What counts as appropriate same-sex interaction is largely conventional. Many Muslim men, as people know, are very touchy-feely compared to men in the West. They're constantly hugging and kissing, and in many Eastern societies, walking hand in hand, even sometimes with their fingers crossed. And this in the West, this would clearly be, you'd say, okay, well, they're gay if two men are walking like that. In the East, this is not taken to be sexual at all. It's just friends are very close. They have close physical kind of contact. However, this is changing as Western norms continue to dominate the world and propagate themselves through media and technology. I was told that, when I was in Cairo in the mid-90s, it was very common for men to walk around of all social classes, holding hands in the streets and hooking arms. And I was told that no one does that anymore in Cairo. Except
I actually asked a friend of mine who's an academic in Cairo, a professor there, and he said exactly what you said. He lives there now. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And this is not good news because it means the entire Western sexual paradigm is becoming deeply imbibed even by Muslims abroad now in the Muslim world, right? And now you have Cairo youth saying, oh, well, that's gay, to walk holding my friend. What do you mean gay? We don't have that concept in Islam. We don't have that concept. We have actions. We don't have a sexual identity to begin with. Well, but guess what? They're taking it on because, again, Western norms are very aggressively pushed as the only valid ones, and Western culture continues to dominate through its products, movies, television, cinema, the internet, and so forth. And so Muslims are not, exempt from being affected by this, but we should be aware of it because it's not innocent, right? It has implications. There are clear Islamic guidelines that transcend culture, right? So we said there was a cultural element as to what is appropriate same-sex interaction. That's not without limits. So again, we've seen there's a prohibition of seeing or touching the awra or private parts of someone of the same sex, specifically, particularly prohibited in the hadith to lie naked together under one sheet, even if the lights are off, because, well, that's a very precarious position to be in. So there are clear Islamic guidelines that kind of transcend culture, but within these guidelines, cultures can differ on these things. Intersex individuals, the khuntha, there's a, quite extensive Islamic discussion of the khuntha, the intersex individual. I will not talk about it here. We have plenty of work, and I'll show in the resources. You can read a lot about this topic. Gender identity disorder. Again, it would be seen more as a psychological or emotional condition. It's not a third sex or a woman, actual woman actually trapped in a man's body. This is kind of a foreign concept, but it would be seen as a psychological or emotional mismatch between the body, which again can be very acute and very painful and very real for people. But the idea is, how do we deal with it and how do we conceptualize it? Mm-hmm. And we said hormonal and surgical transition procedures are not permitted Islamically. All right, the last leg. Are we good to go?
Yes, please.
All right. So what is homosexuality, right? We figured, wasn't this what the whole talk was about? Well, yes, and we've been building up to this, and hopefully, again, all the pieces will fall into place. What is homosexuality? The contemporary background. We always have to question our terms. There's a principle in the Sharia that one can only judge a thing when it is properly conceived. Al-hukmu ala shay' far'un an tasawwurihi. So if you want to say what something is or isn't, or give a moral judgment or legal, we have to have a conceptualization first of what is it. So when you say homosexuality, what is that? I don't even know what that is. I don't have an Arabic word for it. So what is it? LGBT, again, I put it in quotation marks in the beginning because I'm questioning the category, right? I can't translate that into Islamic terms. So we have to understand what we're talking about. So homosexuality in contemporary parlance, and even the word homosexuality now is old-fashioned and considered offensive by many people, and like the LGBT, who identify as LGBT. I think it's fine. I mean, it's just purely clinical. It's like homosexuality, same sex. That's all it means. But anyway, and I prefer to use it because it's not our term. We don't have a term that is exactly similar to that in classical Islamic terms. I mean, there are neologisms that translate homosexuality in contemporary Arabic, but I think homosexuality is more neutral than LGBT, which carries a lot of political and social baggage, and it's best for Muslims to avoid, using LGBT as a term, especially internally, right? Because it brings a lot of baggage and a lot of assumptions with it that we would need to vet and to be critical of. So homosexuality in contemporary parlance, it usually refers to feelings of romantic and or sexual attraction to members of one's own sex. That's one element of it. Another element, engaging in, on the basis of these feelings, engaging in romantic relationships and or sexual behavior with members of one's own sex. So we saw this before, action or attractions and desires, and then behavior that follows thereupon. And then third, adopting a personal and social identity based on such feelings and or relationships and acts. So these are three things which, again, traditionally for us as Muslims and also in the West have been separate. Your attractions are one thing. You're not a specific category of human beings just because you might feel a particular attraction. Even if you act on it, it's an act you do, not something you are. But in the contemporary paradigm, all of those are fused together, inextricably. You're attracted, you act upon it, and that is who you are. It's the basis of your identity. So we have to be very careful as Muslims not to take on terminology which brings on board with it this inextricability, because we have to keep these separate. Otherwise, Islam makes no sense, and we cannot operationalize our categories of thought or our Sharia categories if we do that. So modern culture, again, it amalgamates these three into one. I am gay, lesbian, queer, right? It's something that I am, not something that I feel, not something that I do. This is, again, very new and culturally specific to the modern West. Homosexual sentiment and behavior is widely attested in past societies, but were never taken as an identity. This is very particular to the current cultural moment, right? And is therefore contingent upon that moment, i.e. it was something that you did, not something that you were. Again, that's a good take-home message, phrase to remember, right? And then there's the illusion of any meaningful distinction between desires and actions is morally problematic. So eliding means to get rid of, right? When you say, well, just because I have a desire, I can act upon it. Well, if you apply that consistently, you're going to run into a lot of moral problems and very quickly, right? So of course, the mere existence of a desire can never be a moral justification for acting upon it. We need other moral criteria brought to bear on it. For the contemporary post-sexual revolution West, what's the criterion? Consent. As long as you consent, no problem. For us as Muslims, that's never the criteria. Criteria is what, when God and his messenger have decided upon something, it's not for believing man or woman. When God and his messenger have decided on something, to have a choice in the matter, right? That's our criteria. So we look to Revelation to see what God has actually permitted and prohibited of various desires that we might have. And so considering homosexuality a question of identity rather than a question of acts fundamentally alters the conversation. And this is very important because the modern West, right, just assumes that it is a question of identity and insists on treating it and speaking about it and conceptualizing it in that way. And therefore the deck is already stacked against anyone who's coming from a different paradigm, which says, no, I'm talking about specific acts. No, but those acts are core to who I am. So if you don't accept the acts and celebrate them in your mosque and in your community, then you are excluding me as an entire person. You're undermining me. You're excluding, not recognizing my dignity and so forth. So we saw this before, right? Modern Western culture, it separates these things which should be and are by nature together, sex, reproduction, marriage, morality. And it also amalgamates desires, actions, and identities should be separate, and it puts them together. So again, this slide take a mental picture, keep that in mind. This is really the key to unpacking a lot of this very, complex issues that come up. There's a very good prism to unlock and untangle a lot of those knots. Also, and we talked about this, it incorrectly separates, i.e. sees as free-floating variables, biological sex, gender identity, expression, sexual orientation. We say, no, those should be aligned. Okay, we understand that they might not be, okay, and that's fine. A person's not morally responsible for what they don't have control over, but normatively, yes, they should be aligned, and we're not embarrassed to say that. While drawing a false equivalence between race, gender, and sexual identity or behavior, and throwing, again, race, gender, and sexual LGBT all into one. Again, we talked about why this is problematic. Okay, verses on the people of Lot. We're just going to go through some of this very quickly because someone might say, how can you have such a long talk on LGBT and not talk about the verse in the Qur'an, right? Especially because recently
these are usually the first go-to verses for some Muslims when talking about this. You simply refer to the verses of the people of Lot. None of the preceding discussion happens. And sometimes it is relevant to just go to those verses. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but this is usually how it happens. You just go straight to the verses, those particular ones, right, without any other context or considerations whatsoever. So it's interesting you're doing it this way without a lot of context, historical depth, and theoretical discussions, and as you've done so eloquently. So yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Okay. All right. And so we are almost there, I do promise. All right, so verses on the people of Lot. And again, there has been some contestation of the meaning of these verses by certain, secularly trained Western academics, Muslim identifying Western academics. And, we'll read some of these verses and talk very briefly about it. It's very, very thin, but anyway. So the people of Lot, also mentioned in the Bible, is mentioned in at least 9 different places in the Qur'an, totaling over 75 verses. So this story comes up over and over and over again, okay? Same-sex sexual relations between men, particularly in that story, were the emblematic sin of Lot's people, okay? So every prophet who came, his people had a specific sin that they were known for, and this was the emblematic sin of the people of Lot. Other misdeeds are mentioned in a few verses, actually, I think just one, right? But quote unquote, approaching males with desire instead of females is the transgression that is mentioned most often and in greatest detail with respect to the people of Lot, okay? Revisionists, I just mentioned, they've tried to reinterpret the sin as one of rape or inhospitality to Lot's guests, and we'll see why this is basically, nonsensical. But the Qur'an repeatedly mentions the same-sex aspect of the acts, in particular, as the defining feature of their iniquitous nature. And it's very clear. For example, and mention Lot when he said to his people, do you commit iniquity, fahisha, such as none in creation have committed before you? Okay, what is this iniquity? Verily you come with desire unto men instead of women. Nay, you are a people transgressing beyond bounds. Okay, end of story. But the only reply of his people was to say, turn them out from your town. Truly they are people who keep themselves pure. And then it moves on. So it's not rape. It's not, forcing. It's not... you come to men with desire instead of women. Like, if that's not clear that what's being concentrated on here is the gender of the partner, I don't see how it could possibly be clearer. I mean,
I think there is, without going into this, because this is very long, but I personally, I think the reason is many of people who argue this are drawing on Christian or Jewish interpretations of this story in Genesis, in the Bible, where the rape theme is arguably there, and they're simply reading the Quranic verses through the biblical story, which is actually in important respects different, although there are many similarities as well. So they're basically using a kind of a gay hermeneutic that's been used to justify homosexuality biblically, and just basically, I recognize exactly the same argument because I'm familiar with the biblical story and the revisionist attempts to reinterpret it, and they're basically copying and pasting that and using it for the Quran's narrative. But as you say, the Quran's narrative does actually have that quite distinctive feature of, that they turn to males rather than females, and that emphasis is not as much in the Bible as it is in the Quran. Okay, so they're basically taking that narrative from Christian revisionism and using it for the Quran in a very kind of wooden way, without really attending to the nuances and the details of the Quranic version. in my view.
And that's very interesting. But also, it's, you know, in the Christian and Jewish case, it also is a case of modern, you know, very contemporary reinterpretation, right?
Oh yeah, I don't think it works. I want to
right.
stress, I don't think it works with the Bible either. Actually, I'm
right.
not saying, it's just about rape in the Bible. No, it's not. I think that is a eisegesis rather than exegesis. People are reading into it, their own agenda. Right. But nevertheless, it's even less plausible with the Quran, if it ever was plausible with the Bible.
And there was also the story, and we'll see it, where the angels come in the form of young men to Lot's house, and then the people come after. So you can say, well, maybe they're kind of trying to force. But again, it's very. And
then there's some extremely clear hadith, obviously, which are very specific about the act. So it's pretty indisputable, I think.
Hard to get around, yeah. So great. So the next verse, I'm not going to read it because it's too long. It's just to give context, but again, people will have these slides. You can go back and read it for yourself. We'll just go to these last couple ones to round this off. And mention Lot when he said to his people, do you commit iniquity, fahisha, with eyes wide open? Do you indeed come with desire unto men instead of women? Nay, but you are a people behaving foolishly. Okay, so again, very specific what the problem is with their behavior. And then in another, again, so that was in Surah An-Naml, now Surah Al-Ankabut, and mention Lot when he said to his people, you commit iniquity, the same word, fahisha, such as none in creation have committed before you. Do you indeed come unto men and cut off the road and practice evil deeds in your assembly? So here we get two other things, the sort of highway robbery and then other types of unspecified evil deeds that they practice in their assemblies, which scholars have speculated on, right? So here are some other sins, but we saw in all these other cases, it's like very specifically, the same-sex nature of their act. The reply of his people was but to say, bring upon us God's punishment if you are among the truthful. So they're quite haughty and sort of, not very concerned that this might bring on God's punishment, as if they're challenging him. And when our messengers, and I just mentioned the angels, came to Lot, he was anguished on their account and constrained from helping them. And he said, this is a trying day. And his people came hastening unto him. And before that, they had been working evil deeds. He said, Lot said, O my people, these are my daughters. They are purer for you. So fear God and disgrace me not with respect to my guests. Is there not among you a right-minded man? They said, you know well that we have no claim on your daughters, and indeed you know what we want, i.e. your male guests. Now, this is one of the, verses that the revisionists will point to say, okay, well, look, this is the rape, this is the implied rape scene. And you say, but wait a minute, but Lot's response is, these are my daughters, right? They're purer for you, right? So these are men, here are my daughters are women. What's the difference between the guests and the daughters? It's their gender. And if you assume that these men want to rape the guests, it's not reasonable to think Lot is saying, well, oh, don't rape my guests because that's inhospitable, but rape my daughters instead,
Doesn't make any sense.
Right? I mean, if that were the case, so why is he not blaming them for wanting to rape? Why would he say, take my daughters instead? And then he says they're purer for you. And you don't say, well, don't rape somebody because it's not pure to rape someone. Like, just have consensual sex because it's more pure. Like that's not how anyone talks. I mean, when he says they're purer for you because you're men and they're women, and that's a pure act, right? Not this act with these men. It's like super clear, but again, leave it up to academics to kind of complicate. Right? And so anyway, reinterpreting this as rape, right, is a classic example of anachronistically projecting contemporary notions onto the texts, such as this post-sexual revolution fixation on consent as the only relevant criterion. It's so obvious. I mean, people say, well, wait a minute, it must be that there's a lack of consent here, because that's the only thing that makes sense to us. That's the only crime that we could imagine, is that there was just a lack of consent, and therefore it must have been rape, because don't we all know that consent is really what matters when it comes to sexual behavior? And I mean, this is obviously just, taking like literally the last 3 decades kind of, sexual measuring stick for sexual morality and just projecting it thousands of years into the past and reading it into a text where it clearly has nothing to do with it. But
I mean, it's very interesting. John Boswell, the American Harvard professor, who wrote the classic revisionist work from a Christian point of view on this story in the Bible in the 80s, I think. I mean, he sadly died of AIDS himself subsequently, but he proposed that it was to do with rape and so on. But his work was then, as indeed is often the case, was critically assessed by biblical scholars and was found to be very wanting. And indeed, the top experts now in the biblical field accept that this passage, the Sodom and Gomorrah passage, the Lot passage, and others do speak of homosexual acts, actually, even though these scholars themselves don't agree with the Bible. And I think Professor John Barton, who I've had the immense privilege of speaking to on my channel, professor of Bible at Oxford University, one of the world's leading biblical scholars of the Old Testament, he has said this to me. He said, no, the revisionist argument that it's about rape, it's not really, is completely wrong. It's not based on the Hebrew text. It's eisegesis rather than exegesis. But I, Professor John Barton, don't agree with the Bible anyway. Right. I mean, so you know, and this, and in fact, the world's preeminent scholar in this field is not John Barton. It's a specialist in this area. I forget the scholar's name. He's written the scholarly text is usually seen as the defining. Clearly states the revisionist case has failed and the traditional understanding is correct. But this very author himself doesn't agree with the Bible because they're very liberal, or they view the Bible as purely a human construct, like John Barton very publicly does. So, you know, the traditional reading is the correct one, but many Christians simply don't accept it anyway. They'll say, well, we don't agree with that. We have our own views. We're modern people. We accept the LGBT agenda. So that's a remarkable irony that the traditional reading actually wins at the end of the day, but people still disregard it anyway.
You know what I'd say, Paul? At least be honest. You know, they're being honest. They're saying, well, here's what the text says. We can't make it say what it doesn't say implausibly. We might have wished it to say something different, but it doesn't. And we don't agree with, okay, we're not going to follow it, but okay. But don't try to like play games with what it actually says. And this idea of like, we can just read into it anything we want or historicize.
That's not plausible. I mean, I know advocates say this, you hear this on social media and so on, that serious scholarship doesn't go along with that. But serious scholarship, the individuals who write that will actually accept the gay agenda anyway, because they are modern, enlightened Western people. And part of the liberal academy.
They're not committed to the Bible.
They will accept that publicly. They will say, oh, no, we support all these agendas, even though the Bible, correctly understood in its historical context, is actually speaking of these acts. Yes, they were prohibited then. But today, as John Barton said to me, we live in a different world, and therefore we can accept these acts.
Right.
That's what he argued.
Yeah, exactly. He's British, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I saw that actually, and I remember that.
You remember? Yeah.
You pushed them on that, yeah, and I
did because I've actually got the book here. It's this. I mean, I won't go into the details now, but he's very praising of a top academic work written by an American evangelical scholar, which completely demolishes the revisionist argument. I say, John Barton, how can you agree with this? He says that's brilliant scholarship, fantastic. What is your view? Oh, I accept gay marriage. How can you do that? Well, his understanding of Scripture is very different from the evangelical scholar's understanding of Scripture. It's a human product. Therefore, he is free, serenely free to ignore it in his own modern understanding of human relations.
Right. And, you know, I mean, saying that the Qur'an is a human product, that's
you can't do that Islamically. Islamically, you absolutely can't do that with the Quran. The Quran is
even a revisionist. Yeah, even a revisionist would never say that, because that would just take you out of the fold of Islam. I mean, it's just even not be a Muslim anymore.
In Islam, it's locked down. You can't play that game with the Holy Scripture of Islam. Otherwise, you'd be out of the fold of Islam instantly.
Right. The Quran being the word of God is sort of definitional of Islam. And, you know, a lot of modern Christians and Jews don't really get that, and they kind of say, why are you guys...
A lot of Christian scholars do that. They have a very, very different understanding, because the Bible is a library of books written by many different people, and the historical critical understanding means you can say, well, this is just a human opinion, maybe this is revelation. It's much more complicated.
Right. And so what Muslim revisionists will do, because they don't have the option of saying, well, it's just a human text, they'll say, well, of course it's the word of God, but nevertheless, God spoke to people, you know, according to their Near Eastern context, and they'll try to historicize it. I mean, of course, you know, we do take historical context into consideration. It's part of the Sharia, but there are very specific ways of doing that. You can't just do it like at, you know, with no kind of dawabit or, parameters. And one of these scholars actually, who has been pushing, you know, this kind of revisionist line for a long time, you know, you might say, well, okay, if there's one thing that Muslims could never disagree on, it must be what? Tawheed, like, you know, the oneness of God. That's absolutely the most fundamental. You might say, well, maybe sexual behavior is pretty important, but like Tawheed is like, there's no Islam without that. Okay. This scholar has been pushing this. I just saw like a tweet I don't know when he put it up, but it was just forwarded to me a few days ago, where he actually said polytheism is a derogatory term used by arrogant monotheists who don't understand that their own conception of God is, influenced by their Near Eastern, milieu, right? And they use it to derogate other people. And anyway, these so-called polytheists, that's why I always say so-called polytheism, theism, and so-called monotheism. And in any case, the spirituality of these so-called polytheistic societies has a much better track record when it comes to diversity and tolerance than the monotheists. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, so that's the
religion. Where they're coming from.
Diversity, tolerance.
On every level, that they are,
So you can see that you're going to play that game. Even Tawheed itself.
Even Tawheed is.
Monotheism, you can just historicize it the same way.
Yeah.
And
that's very dangerous.
I mean, but anyway, like, okay, fine. At least you see clearly, like, all right, no, thank you. No, thank you. I mean, how do you even identify as Muslim anymore? That doesn't make any sense at all. So anyway, sometimes it's good when things are stated that directly. It allows you to see.
Yeah. The experts are very clear. The passages do say what people traditionally understood them to mean. That's really beyond dispute now, I think.
Yeah. And so I'll just put here, so the actually I forgot to hyperlink this, but it's hyperlinked in the resources. The classic article on this is by Mubin Vayed, who you've had on here twice.
Very close friend of mine. A couple of times. He's an extraordinary individual, actually.
Yes, mashallah, very, very impressive. Hats off. We all try to follow him.
I had coffee with him in Chicago once. I
heard about that.
My totally irrelevant boast, but I have met him. We actually sat down for a couple of hours and talked shop. It was utterly
he very much enjoyed that, he told me. So, can Islam accommodate homosexual acts? Quranic revisionism, and the case of Scott Kugel. Scott Kugel is this person who wrote this book, with this argument. He's not the author of the.
It's actually this book, which I've got here. This is a book by the notorious Scott Kugel book, which is massively criticized, definitively criticized, many would say, by Mubin Vayed.
By Mubin Vayed, and I mean Mubin Vayed's article is even assigned in university classrooms, right? Because it's at that level. Scott Kugel was not the author of the tweet that I just mentioned, where the person was.
I was wondering if it was.
No, it's someone. It was another academic, but not Scott Kugel. Just again, we have to be fair in our criticisms. If we critique,
I'm glad you clarified that, because that was my assumption.
A person for what he says, not for something he does. The verses on Qamlut, if people want to check them out, here they are. Okay, building an Islamic framework very quickly on homosexuality. Again, one can only judge a thing once it is properly conceived. Al-hukmu ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. So we realize the Western paradigm is just a totally different paradigm. It's not, something that's really compatible. So how do we as Muslims conceive of this? As I said, there's no single word for homosexuality in the Sharia, right? Again, in the West also it's a new word, because the Sharia addresses what? It addresses acts, not desires, i.e. desires that are things that are beyond one's control, okay? Islam does not categorize human beings on the basis of mere desires, sexual or other, i.e. a person does not come to be a particular thing or come to constitute a particular class of human beings, right? A discrete on the basis of mere desires and inclinations. Mm-hmm. Islam also does not place human beings into discrete identity categories on the basis of acts. Even if someone has a desire and is acting upon them, they're still not classified as a discrete, type of human being. They're just someone who's, sharib al-khamr. There's a drinker of wine is someone who drinks wine. If you stop drinking wine, you're not sharib al-khamr, right? If you're engaged in same-sex behavior, okay, maybe there's a term that describes your behavior. If you don't engage in it, there's no term that applies to you just because you might have the desire or may have engaged in the act. Question, what is the best way to answer the question? What does Islam say about?
I know the answer. Before you tell us what the answer is, I have the answer. Watch this video.
Watch this video. Yeah, all three on screen, whatever.
That's the answer to that question. Watch this video.
So homosexuality, I hope people learn by now. What? That's a foreign term. I don't understand what it means. We have to break it apart. So what do you mean by homosexuality? Question your terms always. So we have to distinguish between desires, acts, and identity. Again, in Islam, these are all three separate things. They have three separate rulings, three separate considerations, three separate conversations. They're not just wrapped up into one. What are the implications of accepting a Western sexual identity framework? Again, we've already hit this home on this several times. The identity framework changes the discussion. It elides moral concerns, puts them completely to the side. And it frames the issue as one of social justice defined subjectively, as opposed to one of God's command, Allah's command, which is paramount, obviously, for us as Muslims, and which itself embodies perfect justice. We cannot be more just than God. We cannot be more compassionate. He is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, right? And when I say it changed the conversation, when I was growing up in the 80s, it was still common for people to say, LGBT didn't exist, by the way, only homosexuality. I mean, the acronym, I think, came in the 90s. And people would say, what do you think of homosexuality? This was commonly asked in the 80s. And it was understood, again, the larger assumptions of the culture, it was understood that you were asking about the actions, right, and you were asking what was your moral opinion of them. It was understood that the question was asking about the morality of the actions. And most people would have said, I think it's wrong. That was like the normal thing to say in the 80s. Now it's not, the word homosexual is not used. Asking where you stand on it is like unacceptable. Right? We've replaced it now with LGBTQ. The reason why I say Muslims should avoid this term is because it is an identity term. I mean, it is inherently an identity term, the way it's been used. So the only question today, and it's not really a question because there's only one answer that you can have, is where do you stand on LGBT rights? So it went in 30 years from what do you think about the morality of a particular act to where do you stand on the civil rights of a discrete minority? Forget about what the acts might be at all. It's just a question of, do you believe in equality, freedom, and justice, or are you a bigot who hates people? I mean, that's how it's like, that's the conversation today, right? And this is a direct result of the identity paradigm, primarily. So, the last part of this then, how can we build an Islamic framework? How does the Sharia classify sexual acts? Well, there are halal and haram. So permissible and impermissible. That's the basic distinction in the Sharia. What's halal? We've already seen this. A man and a woman bound by an Islamically valid contract. What's haram? All else. We've seen that, okay? Haram acts, sexual acts, are further divided into gross enormities, which are called kaba'ir, plural of kabira. We saw kabira earlier. Kaba'ir is the plural. So what are the gross enormities when it comes to sexual behavior? There are two. One is male-female zina, which is vaginal intercourse between a man and woman, not married to each other, okay, or bound by a contract. And male-male liwat, sodomy. I mean, specifically between two males. Between a man and a woman, it's also forbidden, but it's, it's a different category between two men. So these two actions, zina and liwat, fornication and sodomy, are considered gross enormities. And then you have other sexual acts, which are neither of these two, which are actually non-penetrative. And for that reason, they don't reach the level of being sort of gross enormities, although they are also forbidden. And so this would include all non-penetrative forbidden sexual acts between members of the opposite sex, members of the same sex, just the whole gamut, including what's known as sihaq, which is a specific word, and it means grinding. So literally female sort of genital grinding, i.e. lesbian acts. So all of these, any type of non-penetrative sexual act between other than a married man and woman would be considered prohibited. And gross enormities are penetrative intercourse between a man and a woman, vaginal, and male-male penetrative intercourse, the one that Burger King, is celebrating with the Whopper.
Oh, I was trying to forget about that. You just reminded me of
it.
Well, I'm never going to be able to go to Burger King again and eat a hamburger there. Not that I do particularly, without thinking about those stuff. Anyway.
Well, yeah. Anyway, so all of these things are called muharram li dhatihi, which means all these acts are prohibited intrinsically, like for themselves. The acts themselves are prohibited, right? And then there are preludes to these prohibited sexual acts, such as we've seen this before: touching, gazing, khalwa, being alone in an isolated environment, immodest dress, speech, and behavior. These are all considered muharram li ghayrihi. They are prohibited on account of another, i.e. because they lead to that which is prohibited in and of itself, which are the sexual acts themselves, right? Okay, so that's done. The very last part of this, and I promise this is the last part of this before we just finish with the conclusions and then the resources. What about the subjective experience? And I said we would talk about this, and we've talked about it a little bit along the way, right? Someone who is a Muslim who says, I feel same-sex attractions, I'm not attracted to the other sex. I wish I were, but I'm not, and I can't just turn it on and off like a light switch. How do I live my life? Does Allah hate me? Am I a walking sin? Am I going to hell for these feelings, right? These are very important questions, and people who have these feelings, particularly same-sex desire, it's all thrown together. The Qawm Lut, the people of Lut, and fire and brimstone rain down upon them. Okay, but wait a minute, they were acting on it. You're not acting. Again, you're putting yourself with them because you're not distinguishing acts from behavior, because that's part of the modern paradigm. You are seeing them all together, but that's not Islam. Islam sees the desires one thing, the acts are another, right? So there are Muslims, faithful Muslims, believing Muslims, practicing Muslims, who experience unchosen same-sex attractions and or gender dysphoria. This is real. This is statistically any, certain human population will have always a number of people who face these types of issues. And Muslims, are naive if they think this doesn't exist in the Muslim community. It absolutely does, much more than people actually would think, because it's obviously not talked about, right? But this is a very real issue. All sorts of issues. Muslims are human beings like others. We have anger issues, drug addiction issues. We have issues of corruption and cheating and this and that, and all human virtues and vices, to one degree or another, are going to be present in any human community. We hope among Muslims, the virtues would be greater and the vices less than people who don't practice the religion of Islam, and that's generally the case. But nevertheless, we will always find, and this is not virtue and vice, it's just internal conditions. We said, again, very important, and I'm speaking, obviously, people watching this, some people watching this will be Muslims who are watching this because they themselves fall in this category, and they are concerned, how can I understand myself? What do I do with my religion? What do I do with my sexuality, right? Islam does not define or categorize people on the basis of internal feelings. You are not a specific subcategory of Muslim. You are a Muslim like anyone else, a brother, a sister, a member of your masjid, right? You are not this specific kind of separate category of human being because you feel this particular thing, right? And again, we must always distinguish between the feelings and the acts on one hand, and also between the acts and advocacy on the other, which we're starting to see, unfortunately, more and more of, okay? Muslims struggling faithfully, and this is also for everyone who's listening, especially Muslims who maybe are not dealing with this, Muslims struggling faithfully with either SSA, so same-sex attractions, or GID, gender identity disorder or dysphoria, they should be, I said struggling faithfully should be embraced and supported as mujahidun in the path of Allah. These are people struggling in the way of Allah. They're struggling with challenges and temptations, like we all have our challenges and temptations, and they are trying to live their lives according to the will of God and to submit, which is every Muslim struggle. And that is the straight struggle. Ihdina sirat al-mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. Every Muslim is trying to go the straight path. No, the pun is intended here. And there is a support group called Straight Struggle. You can just click on this hyperlink.
Yep.
And it is a support group for Muslims who experience same-sex attractions or gender dysphoria, but who are committed to Islam and to living their lives.
It's a very good group. I do recommend it.
Right. And so they are coming together to support themselves and share resources and so on and so forth. And there's also a group based in the UK, Strong Support, Brother Ali Al-Jafari. This started about 2 or 3 years ago. So you have these two support groups, right? Now, Muslims, again, who don't deal with this should be aware. These feelings cannot simply be turned on and off like a switch. Well, akhi, that's disgusting. Well, like Allah gave you women. Well, okay, yes, that's right. But this goes much deeper than that. It's not simplistic in that way. And people, again, we can't afford to have such a simplistic, understanding, especially given our current context. If you speak that way, people say, okay, this person has no idea what this is even about, right? And therefore, anything you say on the issue is just going to sound, ridiculous to many people, including many sincere Muslims, by the way, right? Again, the gay identity paradigm is very, very, this is a very critical thing that, the identity paradigm is a big trap. It is a trap for the community because it completely upends the moral discourse of the Sharia. It upends the moral discourse because now the Sharia is excluding people's core identities and undermining their dignity. This makes mincemeat of the Sharia. Also, this can be a trap for the person, him or herself, right? You're born in the modern world. Okay, well, this is who I am. Islam would say, this is not who you are. You're a Muslim. You're a servant of God. You're a creature of God. You don't have to identify with your sexual drives, even if you have exclusive same-sex desires. Okay, that's something about you, something you have. That doesn't define who you are at your core, right? Again, I hope you can see now, this is a modern social construct of the contemporary West. This is not universal. It is not Islamic. Yesterday or today, this does not exist in other times and places. You won't find corresponding vocabulary in most other languages in the world, today. or in the past. If it's today, only because they're translating from Western languages, because again, the dominance of the Western paradigm, right? But if you are someone who has grown up in the West, then you have no other language except, oh my gosh, I feel this, I'm gay, this is who I am. You have no other language to process it because that's the only language that's available to you in the cultural sphere. And this talk hopefully has helped you to see that, wait a minute, that's a very contingent and specific way of construing this experience, right? And it can be construed other way, and these desires can be shuffled around and they can be given a different meaning in my life, and they don't have to form the core of my identity. And and it could in fact be very liberating not to have to carry around this burden that, okay, this is kind of who I am at my core, right? Especially when it conflicts with acting on it, conflicts with the religion. This puts you in a very difficult situation. But that identification, don't take it for granted, right? Now, other Muslims who are hearing this, don't say, if someone comes to you with it, oh, well, don't identify it. Okay, easier said than done, when for 20, 30 years or whatever, or 15 years, all you've grown up in this kind of identity paradigm. And if this has been your struggle and you've come to see yourself as a quote unquote gay person, right? It's not just by hearing one talk or reading one article that you're going to just undo all of that. And, oh, okay, tomorrow I don't identify anymore. I have these desires, but they're just desires and not who I am and all. Okay, this takes time. This takes, really a lot of thinking and redoing one's emotional and, internal, rearranging one's furniture and all of that. Don't expect someone to just oh, well, Dr. Sharif said this was just Western contingent, whatever. So, yeah, well, it's true. But again, we're all products of our time and place, and we have to look at this realistically, right? I've mentioned before, and we're coming to this now, this is going to be the end. We have a wealth of resources in our community to help faithful strugglers on this path, right? A beautiful article that I think all Muslims should read, especially in the West, whether they deal with this issue personally or not. It's called From a Same-Sex Attracted Muslim, Between Denial of Reality and Distortion of Religion. Beautiful piece written by Brother Yusuf, who has been the, yes, I think it's been published in there as well. Yes,
it is. It's a Sex Matters, Love, Marriage, and the Sunnah. That essay, isn't it? This book is also, I do recommend this generally for general discussions of sex in the Islamic tradition.
And of course, Paul has it right at his fingertips, right? Every relevant book, Truman and everything I've mentioned. Where's your McIntyre? I didn't see it after Virtue.
Of course,
right there. Okay, right there.
I have two copies, actually.
Brother Yusuf,
he revised it. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Brother Yusuf has been the moderator of the Straight Struggle support group for 20 years. Yeah, and he wrote this very beautiful article. And then a game changer, in my opinion, is A Way Beyond the Rainbow podcast. Brother Wahid Jensen, 88 episodes. 88 episodes
wow.
That deals with this topic from every possible conceivable angle that you can think of. Psychological, spiritual, social, personal, family, community, imams. I mean, same-sex attraction, gender dysphoria, marriage. I mean, everything, 88 episodes. And I'll show you a little bit more of the details in a second on that, right? Some questions we won't be able to deal with these. Distinguishing being gay, so that's the identity paradigm, from having same-sex attractions. We've talked about this. Where does homosexuality or same-sex attractions come from? I refer you to episodes 7 and 8 of the podcast, Way Beyond the Rainbow. The brother goes into a great detail on all of the research that's been done on this, what it says and what it doesn't say. So I won't repeat any of that here. Can homosexuality be quote unquote cured or overcome? Again, very murky and fraught question that cannot be answered. Overcome, it depends what one means by that. Cured, I mean, again, you can find answers to that in that podcast. Can someone with same-sex attractions ever hope to marry Islamically, i.e. to an opposite sex partner, have a family? Some perhaps not. Again, this is a big question, and there are several episodes dedicated to this in the podcast. So I refer you to that.
Just on that, I know it's coming to the end, but just on that very question, it's quite interesting that I once read an article by a quite a respected gay journalist, actually, who said it's the big secret of the gay community, is that most gay men can actually function heterosexually, and because it's relatively uncommon to have people who are 100% gay. There's always, most gay men can, if they wished, function heterosexually. And of course, the most famous example of that would be Oscar Wilde, who actually had a family. He was married and had children. He could function heterosexually, although he was gay. So people forget that and think, well, if a person is gay, that is their whole identity and their whole possible expression of sexuality. It's usually not actually. And there are people who I know who identify as gay, but I know that they have a heterosexual component because they told me they do, but they don't identify that way. So this is very, very true. It's quite so. In a different age, many of these people would have married, perhaps, and had children, but in today's age, they don't because they don't have to.
Yeah.
That pressure.
They would have married, had children, maybe had these desires. If they were pious, they would have refrained.
And they could function satisfactorily as heterosexuals.
Played around on the side, but it was not who they were, but today you're told if you feel like one drop of you're attracted to someone, okay, well then you're just a closet homosexual and that's who you are, and you're denying your
or you're bisexual and you must express both. So the whole thing has been configured very differently then. It didn't have to be this way, but as you repeatedly says, a very historically contingent and recent development in just one part of the world, the West, which because of its geopolitical power now is hegemonic over the planet. But it wasn't always that way. In fact, 5 minutes ago, in historical time, it wasn't. It was very different.
Absolutely. Yep. And again, that goes back, the identity paradigm is absolutely, it's key to all of this. I mean, it really explains, everything that we see. How best to deal with individuals who experience SSA in our communities, families, etc. Again, all of this is, very dealt with in great detail in the podcast, especially season 5. Season 5, Brother Mubin Vayed is on 4 different episodes. Imam Dawood Walid is on. Sheikh Mustafa Omar is on, who's done great work on this issue and has researched a lot into same-sex attraction, gender dysphoria. He's spoken very eloquently. So a lot of the sort of well-known scholars in the West and thinkers are actually share their experiences on this. So again, I won't repeat here because we don't have time. And again, I can refer you to the podcast. How best to deal with non-Muslim colleagues, classmates, etc. when it comes to this issue. Again, I think the episodes, particularly with Sheikh Mustafa Omar, really goes into the details. And also, people ask, well, what about pronouns at work? And I have to, he goes into all of this. Sheikh Mustafa Omar, if you go to the episodes that he does. How should Muslims deal with the cultural and political pressures stemming from this issue in the public square, particularly in the West? I refer you again to Brother Mubin Vayed's recent article from this January, Where the Rainbow Ends, American Muslims and LGBT Activism.
Mubin came on Blogging Theology to discuss that article in detail. So you can see a video or read the article.
Exactly, or both.
Or both.
Right. Okay. Now we're just wrapping up. Alhamdulillah, we're almost at the end. So towards principles, I have 2 slides here, and this is basically just a wrap up, the take home message from the entire evening or morning or wherever you are in the world. So what do we need to do as a community if we want to, I think, deal with this issue effectively and in a just, compassionate, and correct way? We need to strongly and confidently establish our Islamic gender and sexuality paradigm. Is very different from the contemporary Western one. We believe in gender essentialism. We believe in the gender binary. We're heteronormative. I mean, it's all of these terrible words that you've been told are like from the devil. We deconstruct that. All that's all concocted vocabulary, right? And we go to the ma'ani, we go to the meanings, and we look at the wisdom of the legislation of our Creator, and we understand it, and we establish it. The gender and sexuality paradigm, right? So again, gender is binary, gender differences are real and God-given. Again, these are just take-home messages. Sexual expression is legitimate only in the context of marriage, which is by definition heterosexual. We should also critique and deconstruct, as we've tried to do, Paul and I, in this podcast. We should actively critique and deconstruct the Western paradigm post-sexual revolution and show what is wrong with it, because it's harmful to people. It's not just because Muslims don't like it. It harms people, right? It leads people to destructive behaviors. It leads them to sexual chaos, and not just in the realm of homosexuality. I mean, just even heterosexual sex is a mess in the West today. Marriage is a mess. Partnering is a mess. The sexual marketplace is a disaster. I mean, there's the repercussions and the fallout of the sexual revolution. No one wants to talk about it because it would strike at their core ideological and moral commitments. We still have people who grew up on drinking the milk of the sexual revolution who are adults today, and they're not willing to fundamentally question their basic assumptions that they've taught made them enlightened modern people, post 60s. And we're going to continue to pay the price as long as that's the case. I'm sorry, Paul, you were going to say.
No, I interrupted you. No, I was going to say that there's also the geopolitical position here, that before there was Western colonialism, it was perhaps economic, and then it was political, then it was military. But today, Western colonialism, in my view, is heavily ideological, and they can have the other things as well, of course, but it has a new virulent form of ideological colonization, where, like you mentioned the tweets where the American government is tweeting the Muslim world, which is considered highly provocative, of course, by many in the Muslim world. And this is a new form of colonialism, which is this LGBT colonialism, which is non-negotiable. So the rest of the world must convert, submit, obey unconditionally to the latest Western colonial project, which is
changing all the time, by the way.
This is why it's so tiresome, isn't it? It's always changing. How much more? Because Islam, as I repeatedly say, is based on the stability of God's revelation to humankind, and is not constantly having to reinvent itself. So it's a sure anchor or rope, as you put it earlier on, for people to hold on to. But this is, I think, a manifestation of neo-colonialism, where the rest of the world is expected to come into line with Western interests and ideas and ideologies as a matter of principle, because the West knows best. It always has and always will do. That's absolutely, which is a huge arrogance and a form of imperialism itself, of course.
Yep, I agree with you 100%. And ironically, it's a lot of these kind of people within the academy or some of these sort of more left-leaning spaces who talk of colonialism and neo-colonialism and post-colonialism, but they're also very heavily invested in kind of pushing this particular narrative. And it's like, isn't it obvious to you that this is just, you talk about Victorian morality being brought into the Muslim world by British colonialism in the 19th century. Okay, yes, that's true. But you're doing the same thing now in the 21st century.
Exactly the same thing, because these ideologies were born in Britain and America and Germany and France.
Absolutely.
And it's exactly the same places. And the movement of influence and power and colonialism is exactly the same movement from one place to another. It's all the same thing, but in just a different guise, a different dress. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so rejection. So we talked about this a lot. Again, take-home message: rejection of the sexual identity paradigm. We must once again separate desire from action from identity. These are three separate things, just like race, gender, and sexual behavior. Those are three separate things, right? Desire, action, and identity, separate. We have to separate these. And we also have to bring back together sex, reproduction, marriage, morality, put those together, okay? Terminological implications: we should avoid identity-laden vocabulary like gay, LGBT, right? These are heavily identity-laden terms. Or dignifying, quote unquote, who people are. Well, who are people, right? They're not their sexuality. Especially as a Muslim, we dignify people as Muslims, right? So all this language about, dignifying who people are, right? And using sort of vocabulary that's laden with identity implications, especially, again, when we deal with the outside society, you should try to be careful of your vocabulary you use, but you have to negotiate. But inside the Muslim community, these are not terms that we should be using, which is why at the beginning of this talk, I put LGBTQ in quotation marks, because it's not a term that I, as a Muslim speaker, am using with an audience, whether Muslim audience, probably majority Muslim, but also non-Muslim audience, right? It's a term that I think needs to be problematized, right? And so that's why I put it in quotes, right? We should use descriptive terms instead, and adjectives, not nouns. So someone has homosexual feelings, experiences same-sex desires, very different from saying they are gay. And even in the medical field, they say so-and-so, has, has diabetes. They stop saying so-and-so is a diabetic. I mean, they've shifted in medical, right? Yeah, they shifted because you are a diabetic. I'm defining you according to your illness. No, you are a X person and you have diabetes, but you're not a diabetic, right? So we should also be, sensitive to that language use. I say no gay exceptionalism, either positive or negative. What do I mean by this? So pushing acceptance of LGBT acts in an Islamic environment, like schools, mosques, communities, and so forth, is just as unacceptable as pushing alcohol, zina, or anything else that's forbidden by the religion. There's no exception here because, again, we're not tying this to identity. Only when you tie it to identity do you have to see, that, right? And you see this also in the current society. For example, I was at a university once, and they're the gay pride student group. They were having a dance, right? And the advertisement for the dance, the poster was, come to this pride dance, whatever, Saturday. And the picture on it was a drawing. It wasn't like a photograph. It was like Art Deco figures, like two men completely naked dancing. And the picture showed everything right down to the very bottom of the groin, as far as you could go possibly, without showing like the organ. So, I mean, clearly the people are meant to be shown like dancing naked. And I think if that were just any other student group, like the Latino club or the, whatever, or the dance club, and they showed like a man and a woman dancing who were like naked on the poster, you'd be like, what? Like, what kind of dance is this? Like, why are the people naked on the poster, right? They wouldn't be considered acceptable. But if it's a pride parade or like an LGBT dance, that's perfectly like, there's like an exceptionalism here that, okay, yeah, you can have very provocative or kind of images that would otherwise be considered lewd and inappropriate, but because, you're basically defining your identity by this, well, we're not going to say anything. And so there's kind of an exceptionalism. So we should not accept that as Muslims, right? We have a moral standard and we stick to that. At the same time, so there's no like positive gay exceptionalism, but also not negative. So again, and I say this to Muslims of probably a more traditional bent or people who they consider themselves like, okay, well, we're firm and hardcore on this issue. Be careful, right? As I said before, you might be more impacted by the modern Western paradigm than you yourself imagine. Merely having and faithfully struggling with same-sex desires or gender identity issues also does not merit any particular stigma or singling out. Someone comes to you, you're a friend, I've known you for so long, I have this big thing I want to share with you, it's so difficult for me. You don't just, go away. No, this person's coming, they've made themselves very vulnerable. You help them, you embrace them, you support them, right? And you don't specifically stigmatize them for something that they don't, did not bring upon themselves and are not morally responsible for, right? We're not talking about people who are pushing the actions or advocating. We're talking about someone who feels a desire and is struggling with it, right? We don't have a particular, stigma or singling out for this or say, oh, that's the gay brother, whatever. No, gay brother, okay, now you're a Western, modern Western. Don't tell me you're a traditional Muslim and you say gay Muslim. Well, what do you mean gay? Say that in Arabic. Tell me that in classical Arabic. I don't have a word for it. I don't have a word for gay. I don't. There's no word that covers, identifying a person based on sexual feelings. It doesn't exist. I can only name people who are doing things. Or gender, male, female, so forth, okay? All right, balancing individual and community, subjective feelings versus objective truths. We talked about this, the objective right and wrong, the objective nature of acts and how Allah has defined them and legislated according to them, and the subjective feelings of people who are facing these desires, right? So as I said before, individuals dealing with same-sex attraction or gender identity issues should be supported in their efforts to realize their purpose as Muslims and live their lives in submission to Allah and His deen. Again, go back to that, article by Brother Yusuf, from a same-sex attracted Muslim between distorting reality and denying reality and distorting religion, okay? So we should have private support and consultation to people who deal with these issues, right? Someone comes to you, they should be able to go to an imam, to their parents, to trusted individuals, right? Like with any other problem they might have and need support, they should be able to find it within supportive and compassionate and loving communities, right? But this is private. Like if I have a drinking issue or anything else, right? I'm going to go and speak about it private. I'm not just going to come in and wear it on my shirt and sort of set up a table at the mosque. That's a very different thing, right? So private support and consultation, people should have people within the community to turn to, right? As opposed to public, quote unquote, accommodation or inclusion. Again, I put these in quotes because these are buzzwords. Accommodation, inclusion, right? They sound very nice, but they mean something very specific, which is not acceptable given our moral framework as Muslims, right? Defiant activist types within the community should not be allowed to disrupt Islamic spaces or impose their will on the community. Again, no exceptionalism here. You want to come to the Eid celebration and set up a wine table, that's not going to be tolerated. You drink on your own time, that's your own business. You don't come and push it on the community. No exceptionalism when it comes to sexual behavior that is prohibited by the religion. Supporting the faithful struggler, we've done this, show empathy and understanding for what is often a very difficult and emotionally taxing issue. support the person in general, spiritual and other ways, mentorship, general advice, listening ear, shoulder to cry on, right? But also, again, this is someone comes to you privately, know your limits. You are not a spiritual guide. You're not a professional psychologist. It's a deep issue and you don't know the details of it. So what? Direct them to resources, such as all the resources we have in our community, such as A Way Beyond the Rainbow, podcasts, and these other resources, and maybe offer to discuss. But know your pay grade, as Paul said earlier. Don't go beyond your pay grade. And then finally, maintaining the straight path, clarity, compassion, conviction, the 3 C's. We've come up with this in some other groups, right? You are not more merciful than Allah, right? So people say we need to be compassionate. Of course we do. And true compassion is guiding to the truth and what pleases the Creator. This is what is going to be best for people in this world and in the next. This is true compassion. Compassion is not to usurp the place of God, overrule his legislation because you know better, right? This is something that people who, they come with this argument from compassion and justice. You're not more compassionate and just than Allah. He is Al-Adl, he is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, and none of us can claim those titles for ourselves. Be humble and kind, but never apologetic about Islamic beliefs, right? We're not apologetic. Islam is clear. It's from the Creator. It's the birthright of every human being to know about it, to be told and to be invited to it. And Allah guides whom he wills. It's not in our hands, right? Islamic teachings, very important take-home message, and this is the last one. Islamic teachings on sexual ethics are not an embarrassment or a problem. Listen, youth in the West, right? Islamic teachings on sexual ethics and gender and sexuality and the whole gamut are not an embarrassment or a problem. They are the only solution to our problems. They are the solution that the West itself desperately needs, and we all desperately need. And it is for us to realize that and take it on and articulate it in the best and most beautiful way. As we read in the Quran, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'izati al-hasana wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan." Call to the way of your Lord with hikmah, wisdom, and beautiful exhortation, and dispute with them in the best possible way, right? This is the command that we have been given. And on this, I will just resources, we have actually seen them from a same-sex attracted Muslim, between denial of reality and distortion of religion, Brother Yusuf. Please, I think everyone should read that. It's not very long, beautifully written. Way Beyond the Rainbow podcast. I'll show you some details on it in the very last slide. We've seen Brother Mubin's piece, Can Islam Accommodate Homosexual Acts? Quranic Revisionism in the case of Scott Kugel. This is a masterly scholarly study. I mean, really, hats off. It's really extremely well done. And you will learn so much about Islam and about categories and about the contingency, about sexual categories. Even if you're not particularly interested in this article, it's a very informative and educational read. So I think Muslims should challenge themselves. It's like 50 pages. It's not short, but it's really worth your time. You'll gain a lot intellectually.
I agree with I agree with your assessment there. Absolutely. Yeah,
absolutely. And the male is not like the female from the Quran. وَلَيْسَ ذَكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى. We saw that Islam and gender nonconformity. Also, again, Brother Mubin Fayed, right? He's almost single-handedly carrying this, has been carrying this burden for the past, 5-6 years. May Allah bless him. Muslim Matters 2017, that was part 1. Part 2 was co-authored between Brother Mubin Vaid and Brother Wahid Johnson of the A Way Beyond the Rainbow podcast. This is an 85-page study based on 150 or 60 sources, right? It's a massive, massive study on transgenderism, the history of it, the contemporary scene in the West, also Muslim rulings on it. Okay, so anything you want to know about transgenderism, these 2 articles are key. Foundational articles on gender, the family, and sexuality by Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, one of our treasures in the West, has also been a guest on this podcast before. 3 of his articles, they're mostly quite old. Boys Will Be Boys, Gender Identity Issues, Islam, Irregular, and the Retrieval of Gender, Fall of the Family, all of them very, very insightful, incredibly eloquent, as we know from Sheikh Abdul Hakim, mashallah, always very insightful and extremely eloquent. So these, I think, are, again, somewhat dated, but they're still relevant. And I think foundational for any Muslim, intra-Muslim discussion on gender and sexuality issues in general, and homosexuality, of course, in particular. And then this last resource, Islam and LGBT Issues, reading material, mohammedandiscourse.blogspot.com. Tons of all of these resources and a lot more are on this particular website. And then finally, because I've talked about this, A Way Beyond the Rainbow, I think it is a game changer. It is very easy to critique a religious community by saying you're stuck in the Middle Ages, you're stuck in your books, you have no idea what's going on, or you're all just heteronormative and you don't understand our position, i.e. we who experience same-sex attractions. This cannot be the case here, right? This brother is coming from that inside perspective. He is a doctor and a medical researcher. He knows what he's doing. It's extremely well researched, extremely well documented, and very interesting, and a lot of also guests and things like that. So Way Beyond the Rainbow is a podcast series. This is the tagline, discussing the everyday struggles of Muslims with same-sex attractions, SSA, and gender dysphoria, who want to live a life true to Allah and Islam. This podcast series is a safe space for Muslims who struggle with SSA, as well as parents, family members, friends, imams, chaplains, community leaders, and the community at large. It is separated into 5 seasons. Season 1 tackles topics, just to give you an idea, shame, vulnerability, self-compassion, identity, so on and so forth. Okay, I won't read everything because it's season 2 tackles the spiritual dimensions related to this particular struggle, right? How can people understand the spiritual dimensions of this particular struggle, every struggle, but this particular one, from the wisdom of hardships and tribulations, attachments and surrender, as well as gifts and divine openings, futuhat, ilahiyya, rabbaniya, to the struggle with temptations and desires, sin and repentance, as well as the story of the people of Lut and of many of the other prophets whose stories are relevant to every struggle, including this particular struggle. Season 3 focuses on the importance of support systems and social connections, and answers frequently asked questions when it comes to friendships and support groups. The season also tackles in-depth topics of marriage and celibacy, i.e. for people who experience same-sex attractions, as well as marital intimacy and sex, right? So again, it's completely comprehensive. Season 4, dedicated to healing and recovery work, tackles foundational topics relevant to the healing journey. And this is actually relevant to people who don't even experience same-sex attractions, just general, complex trauma. He takes a lot from the sort of contemporary psychological perspectives, but from an, Islamic angle. Emotional attachments, dependency and codependency, and then, sexual compulsions and addictions, as well as sexual abuse. So these things are unfortunately relevant to a lot of Muslims, have experienced sexual abuse, whether they experience, same-sex attractions or not. Sexual compulsions and addictions. There are, I think, 4 episodes on masturbation, pornography addictions. And again, unfortunately, given the state of current technology and so forth, many Muslims, we are not immune to these struggles, and many Muslims, quite apart from same-sex attraction, deal with, issues of sexual compulsion, issues of pornography addiction, and so forth. And so you can also find very beneficial things here. And then the last season addresses the wider community and focuses on relevant socio-political themes such as revisionist movements. So again, Brother Mubin does the whole takedown of the revisionist, arguments based on his work, Sharia perspectives, gender dysphoria and transgenderism, and also topics that are relevant for parents and family members, i.e. of Muslims who have same-sex attraction or gender identity issues, for spouses, teachers, imams, and community leaders. So completely comprehensive. And again, a lot of Muslim kind of personalities have come. There are also personal stories scattered throughout the podcast. A Muslim sister who left a same-sex marriage to come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and other such stories that are very interesting and not really what you hear every day in the kind of barrage of kind of pro-LGBT messaging that we are subjected to. So, أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه. And I thank everyone for your time and attention. I think Brother Paul, especially, everyone else can stop and start, but you've been sitting here for, I think, what's coming up on 4 hours now, and I know you've been traveling.
4 hours, gosh.
And yeah. I imagine this must be the absolute longest episode you've had.
Oh, this is a record breaker. This is a record breaker, to be sure.
I'm very sorry to go on and on and on. I think it's an important topic. I hope
I agree. Well, we actually discussed before we recorded this. We discussed whether or not we should cut it up into pieces and stuff, and we decided no, it's best to keep it in as the unity and the integrity of one episode. And even though it is very long, I think there's value in that, and hopefully we will have timestamps underneath it as well as the slides, which will be accessible. So it won't necessarily have to be digested in one large go.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, Paul. You're doing excellent work. Blogging Theology is an amazing resource. For people who are just new to blogging theology, I really strongly encourage you to check out. I mean, Paul is indefatigable. It's unbelievable that literally almost every single day, I think, he has a new episode out. And very often he's discussing deep works with authors that require him to have read these works. I mean, it's not just like,
it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah, but he invited me to talk. I've been, running my mouth for 4 hours, but like usually, I mean, he had me on before, he read my book and other people. And as you've seen, every time someone mentions a book, I don't know how you do it. He just doesn't even get up from his chair, reaches, oh, here's the book you were talking about. Every book you mention is like at his fingertips. So there's something,
not everyone.
Spiritual, I think, futuhat here, some divine openings. May Allah bless you, Paul. We're very happy to have you among us. You're a great asset to our community. And may Allah bless you and everyone who watches your channel and benefits from your channel. And I'll just end as we normally do. Anything that I have said that is right and true is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we thank him for that. All truth and goodness come from the only true, Allah is the haqq, the truth itself, and good and beauty itself. And anything that is wrong or inaccurate, it comes from me and from me alone. And I ask your forgiveness as an audience, as well as Allah's forgiveness for anything that I said that it might have been wrong. I hope I did not say anything that anyone might have found offensive. It was not my intention to. I think in the larger context of what was being said, I tried to hit everything from different angles to make exactly clear what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. These are difficult issues. May Allah help all Muslims deal, whether it's dealing again with society and external pressures, or whether it's dealing with this issue inside your own heart or within your own family or community. This is not going to go away anytime soon. And this is something that we do have to know how to deal with properly and have mature conversations about, principled conversations, but conversations that also the human element is involved. And we understand people are very confused in this time. And we should also be, without letting, again, this sort of activist type run amok, but be gentle with people. People have been hearing one narrative their entire lives, right? It can take some time and some effort and some coaxing to kind of get them to, especially if they're dealing with the, just be patient with people and make dua for people. And may Allah guide all of us to what is best and what pleases him. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sharif, for your outstanding work, presentation, and beautiful slides. And this is going to be a great resource, I'm certain, for many people in the months, maybe the years to come, for a very comprehensive, compassionate, accurate, faithful exposition on the whole question of Islam and the LGBT question, gender, sexuality, morality, and identity. So thank you very much indeed for all your extraordinary efforts in this regard. And until next time.
Okay, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.